A quorum, I call the meeting to order and we commence in public session. I welcome the witnesses and remind those in attendance to make sure that their mobile phones are switched off or in silent mode. Any members of the committee that wish to attend this meeting remotely must do so from within the precincts of Leinster House. This is due to the constitutional requirement that, in order to participate in public meetings, members must be physically present within the confines of the place where Parliament has chosen to sit. In today's case, following agreement of both houses of the Oireachtas, the Parliament precincts include nOileán, Árainn, Mhór, the first time that the parliamentary precincts have included an offshore island. This meeting is the first official Oireachtas business to be held on an offshore island. It signifies the importance of involving all people of Ireland in the democratic process. We, as members of this committee, have a responsibility to represent the interests, concerns and aspirations of island communities throughout our country. But to effectively do this, we must actively engage with you. And that is why the members of this committee were so determined to ensure that Ireland's first ever live parliamentary broadcast outside the city of Dublin would take place on an offshore island. In fact, I believe this may very well be the very first live broadcast of a national parliamentary hearing on an offshore island globally. Through the participation of all involved here today in this historic meeting, we are demonstrating how broadband technology can bring parliamentary democracy closer to the people. And I hope that this can act as a beacon of best practice for other parliamentary committees, both here in Ireland and elsewhere. We're grateful to the Islanders who have facilitated the broadcast of this live meeting and affording members the opportunity to see how advances in communications technology allows people a real and sustainable way to live and work remotely in rural areas. Today we will hear of the unique challenges faced by island communities, but we'll also hear of solutions which, if adopted, not only can address these challenges, but help support isolated communities across Ireland, in fact across the world. Before we start, I wish to explain some limitations to parliamentary privilege and the practice of the Houses as regards references you may make to any other person in your evidence. The evidence of witnesses physically present here or who give evidence from within the parliamentary precincts is protected pursuant to both the Constitution and statute by absolute privilege. This means that you have an absolute defence against any defamation action for anything you may say in this meeting. However, you are expected not to abuse this privilege, and it is my duty as Cathaoirleach to ensure that that privilege is not abused. However, one of today's witnesses is giving her evidence remotely from a place outside the parliamentary precincts, and as such may not benefit from the same level of immunity from legal proceedings as a witness physically present does. Such witnesses have already been advised that they may think it appropriate to take legal advice on this matter. Witnesses are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of a person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you'll be directed to discontinue your remarks. It's imperative that you comply with any such direction. Members are also reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person or entity outside the Houses or an official either by name or in such a way to make him or her identifiable. The committee will now consider the operation of the national and local policies that affect islanders. To this end, today we will discuss the following: climate neutrality and biodiversity on the islands with representatives of Comhar, Fuin of nOileán, Aran, Aran Islands Renewable Energy Cooperative. the housing and sustaining communities on offshore islands with academics from University College Cork School of Applied Social Sciences and representatives of the island communities, namely Comhar, nOileán and Oireachtas na hÉireann. And finally then, e-health and living longer in the islands with representatives from the Health Innovation via Engineering Lab, that's the HIVE lab at University of Galway, and one of the general practitioners serving one of the islands, serving Clare Island and Inishvigal. These issues are of critical importance to this committee and have been a focus of ongoing work of the committee, including the examination of the Sustainable Development Goals and public service performance targets. The issues also encompass my role as chairperson of the Interparliamentary Union Working Group on Science and Technology, which has a global remit to develop greater engagement between the scientific community and national parliaments. I'd like to welcome to the meeting today the manager of Comhar nOileán Aran Chornta, the Aran Islands Renewable Energy Cooperative, Ms. Avril Niskartig, who is joining us remotely. I now invite Ms. Niskartig to make her opening statement. Avril, if you could just pause for a minute. There seems to be a problem with the audio here at this end. Just if you could for a minute. Apologies in relation to it. I don't know if we can hear it on the broadcast, but I know we have a difficulty here in the room with the audio. So we have the technical people just looking at it here at the moment. And we'd better off move on to the next slide. Avril, if you could put the microphone on your laptop on, I think that there's...
Good morning. Yeah.
Now we have you, Avril.
Great.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry about that. So good morning, everybody. My name is Avril Niskartig. I'm a native of the Aran Islands in County Galway, and I'm currently employed as the manager of Comhar nOileán Chornta, or the Aran Islands Energy Cooperative. Our co-op has 5 main goals, which are also in line with the recently published Islands Policy and accompanying action plan. And we believe that the energy transition offers us a unique opportunity to significantly contribute towards achieving these common goals. Now, I won't list out exactly how we plan to achieve these goals, but I'll list out the goals for you there. So our number 1 goal is to stabilise and sustainably increase the population on the 3 islands. Number 2 is to maintain the language, the culture and the heritage of our 3 islands. Number 3 then is to be sensitive to the beauty and richness of the natural environment in which we live. Number 4 is to increase the comfort, energy efficiency and sustainability of our homes and transport. And number 5 is to promote the 3 Aran Islands as lighthouse communities, offering inspiration, support and examples of best practice to other communities in Ireland and throughout the world. In order for our offshore islands to thrive, we need to ensure that the communities living on them are empowered and that they're resilient, and that the disadvantages associated with living on our offshore islands ultimately do not outweigh the advantages. Many challenges felt by mainland communities are often felt earlier and more keenly by island communities. This is true of climate change, the cost of living, and in areas such as housing, education, health, and transport. The energy transition on our islands can have a positive impact in all of these areas, but not without government support and strong political will. By generating our own community-owned clean energy locally, we can make the islands self-sufficient, generate additional employment opportunities, lower energy costs and generate a public income to support local community development projects. This could improve the standard of living on islands, the amenities available to locals, the services available and much more. By retrofitting homes and businesses on the islands to a high standard, we can improve the living conditions in the often older, less efficient and more expensive to run homes, and even free up additional homes which have been left vacant. This would again aid significantly in lowering the cost of living on our islands, solve some of the issues we have in relation to the shortage of housing, improve the health and well-being of our residents, and in turn aid in the regrowth of the island's population. Improve the health and well-being of our residents, and in turn aid. By decarbonising the transport systems both on and to the islands, we can reduce our carbon footprint on the islands. Our transport, mainly transport to the islands, accounts for over 60% of our carbon emissions. That's on the Aran Islands, according to our Energy Master Plan. There's no shortage of examples available to show how important the energy transition on the islands could be in solving many of the challenges that we face. Not only would carrying out this important work help with the problems we face now, but it would also help to sustain the islands long into the future. I understand that all that I've outlined will take significant investment from government and buy-in from organisations like the SEAI, the CRU, ESPN, the local authorities and many more. The will of the community on the Aran Islands is certainly there, and I have no doubt that it is on the other islands too. So far, we on the Aran Islands have retrofitted 50% of buildings across the islands to some degree. Many homes have PV panels generating their own electricity, electric vehicles and heat pumps. But we are finding it increasingly difficult to continue this work without additional measures and funding above and beyond what is already available. We recognise the new efforts being made through the Living Islands policy aims to tackle some of these issues, but that support needs to be scaled up drastically if we're to grasp this opportunity which we now have. I think the islands also present a valuable opportunity to the government to trial a transition to clean energy which maximises the secondary benefits for its citizens, like I've outlined above, and where valuable lessons can be learned before scaling up a similar transition for the rest of the country. And finally, I want to thank you very much for inviting me here today and for giving us this opportunity. Gurmina Malgi.
Thank you, Ms. Nicartig, and thank you for your presentation and your engagement with the committee. I'll now open it up to members for questions, and I'll ask the last Cohar, Deputy O'Cahissy first.
Gurmagat Cohar agus ag tosach bar a bhvalam bhfuchas a gáháil asocht an fáilte críúil atá fáilte goin an sa ó muintir or an Mhór. Agus bhvalam bhfuchas a hort an furin ilig freisin tá anna chuid obair technúil déinte ag an bhórin chuna bheith live an seo aniu. Lá starú le tá muid go léir mar ionadaí ar bobal na níne ach in Newtown Oireachtas ag teacht chuig an pobal agus tá sé tarlú I measc I lár an phobal agus is lá ionach starúile I Mhórmse dá bhór sin. It's brilliant to be here. It really is the Oireachtas coming out and taking place within the community. It's always been our job to, I suppose, take our community's concerns and bring them to Dublin, but it's nice that Dublin is coming down to the community as well. Avril, I just wanted to compliment, there's absolutely incredible work that's happening on the Aran Islands. We certainly have an opportunity to make them lighthouse communities, which is your goal. It makes for a perfect testing bed, particularly like things around sustainable transport. You identified that 60% of the emissions comes from transport. You can see how EVs, e-bikes, shared mobility, these are all particularly applicable to island situations. I just wanted to ask you questions about, it's very difficult. So you have an abundance of renewables. You've made incredible progress in terms of PV. One thing that our offshore islands certainly don't lack is a wind resource, that's for sure. But it's that issue of intermittency. So for the times when, as is often rehearsed, the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing, which might be rare enough on the islands. But the issue around intermittency, and if you really want to move to a point where you're fully energy self-sufficient, what steps are you trying to take in terms of either storage or interconnection? And does there need to be an upgrade in terms of the quality of interconnection between the island grids and the grid on the mainland in order to allow you to move to fully decarbonised energy systems?
Thank you, Mr. Stark.
Thank you. So yes, the short answer, I suppose, is there absolutely needs to be a drastic upgrade of the local infrastructure. So, for example, we are at the moment trying to develop a local community-owned wind turbine project. Originally, we actually have a grid assessment has been done by ESB Networks on that already. And we originally sought permission for a 2.3 megawatt grid connection. So this would allow us to export a maximum of 2.3 megawatts of energy onto the grid at any one time. After much debate and negotiation and deliberation and investigation by ESBN, it turned out that the maximum connection that they were willing to give our project was 650 kilowatts. So that was a massive reduction in the size of our project. Thankfully, our grid connection still means that the project will be viable. The payback period is looking, the figures all match up. It still looks like it will be a viable project, but it wouldn't be producing anywhere near as much energy as what we need. The reason that ESB networks have given us for this is that anything more than the 650 kilowatts would cause voltage issues on the island, because on mainland projects, if you have a turbine or a solar farm, you have a dedicated export line back to the substation. That wouldn't be possible for us on the islands, and it would be cost prohibitive, really. So we would be feeding into the local distribution network on the islands. Now, we have made many proposals to ESB networks around this. We've answered some of the CRU's consultations, and we have, I suppose, tried to get them to agree to testing flexibility and demand response solutions on the islands. This would allow us possibly to generate more clean energy and use that and maybe supplement from the national grid through the subsea cable which connects the three islands. But at the moment we haven't had any luck there. We believe that as the number of homes on the islands with heat pumps and electric vehicles and PV and battery storage grows, that we will be able to, I suppose, continue to expand on that and use flexible demand response solutions in order to help balance our grid. And this is something that will happen on the mainland. It's something that will be felt on the mainland, but I believe that the islands offer a really valuable opportunity to the government and to ESBN to trial and to trial all of these technologies and these solutions, and be able then to scale it up, because the islands are a literal island grid. They're an isolated part of the national grid that operates very much in the same way as the rest of the country. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be the openness or the willingness to trial any new technologies or any new systems on the islands. We are involved in many European research projects through Horizon and Interreg with universities and technological experts around Europe. We have had projects looking at the areas of demand response and smart solutions in homes, for example, for people to use or optimize the usage of the PV on their roofs and domestic buildings. Developing apps in order to notify you when you're producing surplus electricity, for example, so that you can make the most of it and get the benefit of it. This was before there was a feed-in tariff, so it was even more important for homes not to be exporting electricity onto the national grid and not receiving any payment for it. The projects ran very well, they were very successful and very interesting, but I believe that we have a really valuable opportunity on the islands to trial ways of balancing the grid, of, it's this whole thing of flattening the curve that we were listening to long before the pandemic, which is the solving the issues around intermittency and demand and trying to balance it all out. And I think that the islands present a very valuable opportunity to the government and to ESB networks to trial systems that can be put in place in order to tackle that, because it's an issue that is going to be felt nationwide as we move to more renewables. The islands wouldn't be unique in that sense, but we are special in that we can offer them the opportunity to iron out all the kinks before it's scaled up on a national level.
Thank you. Deputy O'Cossie, a brief supplementary.
Yeah, just very briefly, Avril, I wanted to ask whether you've looked at battery storage solutions, which might be a possible solution, or whether you've looked at vehicle to grid, particularly if we move to kind of an EV solution on the islands, whether that might be a possible solution.
So as a very small cooperative, I suppose, with limited technical expertise, we have looked at it ourselves. We are hoping to be able to develop or to join research projects to look into it in more depth on the islands. As time goes on, we haven't been able to investigate it in any real depth, to be honest. One of the issues around battery storage is, again, it's grid connection. So if we were to add a battery to the grid on the islands, ESBN, even if you're not generating electricity, ESBN actually consider battery storage as additional generation for the purpose of offering you a grid connection for your battery. So we have run into issues there with having the 650 kilowatt maximum being imposed on us, because obviously we would have to scale down our turbine project if we were to add additional storage. We have looked at putting it alongside our turbine so that we could at least guarantee an export of 650 kilowatts at all times. But realistically, we would need something more than that if we were to try to decarbonise the islands completely. So we've looked at vehicle to grid as well. The number of EVs on the Aran Islands are quite high in comparison to the rest of the country. We have about, I think it's 30 vehicles now roughly across the islands are electric. And so, you know, they're ideal on the islands. It works very, very well. And I think there is definitely space there to look at vehicle to grid. But we need support and we need buy-in. I think we don't own the grid, so we cannot trial these things without, I suppose, interest from other stakeholders like the CRU or ESB Networks. And so really it's their involvement is critical in order for us to be able to look at these things in any real detail.
Thank you. Deputy O'Huive.
Good morning, As King Clistel fin over Tarbonagui. Lanokun Shesh to Koreak Moholaki. A Vitor Alum, Eroim Teagui le Renewable fin Vedruch de Vahan, Kangalas and Nu, Lecture, Christakati and Tilline, a Vok Iki go Humlan, a Granog Naniline. Agus a Changloch on Fostarshun at a Mhór here, Leshan Ilan. Gediroch, le go bhéiteach sé bheasportáil agus tuile importáil de rimar bheith gá. Mar fechadom sa ganna sin, níl níos bíoga le dhéanana. Ach déiteach rinn na Gaeltacht agus rinne siad hana nó rinne nilein é sinna dhéanana. Agus a miú staidir dhéanana chábla nua a thuirteasteachadí na hilein. Idir snáhin apteach, lechtruchas agus fiú beidir isce ag an am ceanna mar sin dridgeil an rud a chosnis an teirigad leis an na cábla chuirsís. Agus I gaban tú go mé cheart staidir a thosaí sin agus é sin tionscannathe ag go rialtas féin mar gur job mór a bheith a gceist. A dar rud ná ó thaobh na Jonesa sé tar fáil le ha insiúlach dhéanana chiisiúí. An ceart gomach Jonesas níos airde fáil ilein do bhar na costais preise a bhainans le insiúlú dhéanana chiisiú na hilein. Agus a bhétar álam a bhfuil iartas dianta go léide agus cén freigar atá fáite go. Agus I cheart gon chuiste seo bheith a gachannaí gomach Jonesas bhaid níos airde, mar bhí sé an hána gomach Jonesas bhaid níos airde an gon na hilein le ha obair inanúte I dhéanana nó obair crochmhaile. Agus an ceistéirí atá ná maidir leis na teircintí a bheith for a lorg gon na báid amachchan seo. An cheart gon rion a rá aber fi chean deimlíonna go mai ceist fuinmh inanúte a úsáid na báid go hard an list a tosíochta le ha ein conra nó báid le seanta thuairt go locht na mád arú an ggóras atácu go choras inanúte ó ha fuinmh na báid tíochtasteach go dtí na hilein.
Thanks, Gormagat. Miss Ní Sharkey.
Gormagat, as of my cash nation, so the head cash the other thing of we called the new Hermid cashed ed on Ranog ach ni wormwood flaggerbe Arshin Laura mat le ESB lesion on inanthor Artula in Kunan Galvif Mayala in a cobbler Tigan with or good call yes in Europe go Hundul means fád go harta tríocha bliain na cábla Tá cábla tá ana harta tríocha bliain dhís. So dáir do main ceis leis na ESB maidir leis sin sin feagar for mar sin ná go nionú tástálachaí an cábla harta chavíle sa séideag nuair bhís an cábla agus nachrá an cábla ag an uair sin a harta leabhálach chríide síl. So ó dtíobh an ESB capan ar sin go tesin gola cabla tá an faoi láthir sách má fratríocha blian eile. Ní hoigin tesin san áibh is 3 megawatt is féidir a chuir ar a cabla sin, so ní hoigin tesin san áibh an méid an ectrachas atá tastalach tá in úsáid ar na Hilan a bhés a gardú de réir chéile nó rééis muid a gasstrú ó broslíonnta se godí foiinem in anúte le heat pumps le cáin electricha agus rudí mar sin. So ní sin tuí san áibh ach a chuidirbe. Hánach linn a phlé leis an ran go bhecin céird is féidir díanana sínam héingur cheart go méidir gomach se rinte idir coppla ranóg mar tiit an na Hilan faoi ranóg éagsúla agus sílam gurmach deisnaí ítachan sin len cabla nua a síos ein go thomla leat a dríomh an sláin fiber chumá len broadband tá with réúnta má ar na Hilan ach bad is rééis rudí dal chun cín ar mórthaí tuidir mu tíh hir mar bhfuil an ceangal sin an, so tá sé sin fíorthábhachtach agus tá an freisin go bhfuil gan na tuisce ar na Hilan go háidir rin saora má tá bailach gún mu an an sin a réiteach ag an am céanna is fiú an deis sin isru. Tá maidir lena Joontais ar na Hilan faoi láthir tá 50% níos smú go Joontas ar fáil go muintú na Hilan rint gona aibre atá cadíthe ag an SEAI. Ní chlúdín se an ab ar fad, ní chlúdín se le GPV ná solar thermal, clúdín se chuide gona rudí so is costaí ar bhealach heat pumps agus abad an inslú tíh muganteach an external insulation a vín a bhád níos líide ná abad cavity insulation mar hampla. So tá se clúdé ar chuide gona rudí. Ní chlúdín se an one-stop shop seo atá ag an SEAI, so mátá teach nó teilech ar na Hilan ag ggéire deep retrofit íon go teach ní tá a beise le fáilach má úsad in siad an one-stop shop nó deep retrofit grant atá ag an SEAI. Tá na Joontais éonracha an tá an 50% breise sin ar fáil ar chuid gona rudí tá cadí hen sin ach níl ar chunig annach. Tastín a bhád níos mú takeíocht go muinte na Hilan, tastín a bhád níos mú ní amháin, I mean tá méid na Joontais tastín bhain sinna áardú is cínte. Ach tastín a bhád níos mú takeíocht bhain ó léidí SEAI agus mar sin de tá se cínte ar na conrathaí a hirirteach go dtí na Hilan. Tá thuúfas ab arsúil ar a mórthaí faoi láthir, tá gantnas aibrithe ar a mórthaí hána hain tá sanna sin. Tá se fear dacaid ar even tá an slua atá heat pumps acu faoi láthir, tá sé dacaid ar iad sin an serviced. Má tá coháil na rud a be mar sin leanna na rudí tá anhanana, tá se sin fear dacaid agus fecin daoine eile sin agus seans go náir se ingin beidir nach mé se a ggéir heat pump mór bhfuil se an anna coháil a jumphead in ní. So cáid an feib sin a réiteach tá costa sí mar óchan ar fad tá costa sí bhád níos smú i gceist le obair bit a dhéanana ar na Hilan agus cé go bhfuil rintó sin tá rintún na takeí an SEAI a dtí rint gona Joontais sí ní ran se sách fada. Ach cáid bheith an breanúid ar an picture ar fad, ní a bháin ar chuide gona Joontais ach an picture fad termach mas maiile agus máta muid go na tí sin na tí tá ar na Hilan agus na glónaí na fergne ar fad atá ar na Hilan I hirt sus go dtí level áard atá tasta bei Árainn a bhád níos mú abíanana taobh mogan na Joontais freisin. Agus an sin a caiint na báid atá taistil amach chuit na Hilan, Clockmuid deport it tógra interreg le garage that ran huge, so sin hydrogen utilization and green energy, agus rinnemuid cost staidir sa tógra sin na báid far an tóireachta atá techt chuig na Hilan. Comhar agó muid an takeíocht ó an cólacht a víns ag freastal ar na Hilan, bheanmuid ag leor na féidirchtaí a bhhaing le hydrogen mar hapla a úsáid na báid. Agus óchuin brenin se go bhfuil na féidirchtaí an den úsáid ach go dóige sé neart am. So sínam gur smuoine má é dáach an rion a breanú ar an picture go fad hermach ag molla go na báid ach a gaibrú lobchama mar níl se éasca níl se éasca na báid a hain na cólachtaí a hain an talamh seo a cheannacht níl se éasca orb na tá báid réasanta nuáin in se ar na Hiileán ní féidir iad sin na scrapá le lug so cáid réiteach a cinnte áile achas cinnte gur cheart gon rion a bheith ag breanú ar inis agus go méis ag na cólachtaí go bhfuil se a teachta níos síos a bór ach go neibro for lob chumá ag an am chéine.
Deputy Donnelly.
Sorry. It's a pleasure to be here today to see this historic moment where for the first time that we have a committee that's meeting outside of the Dáil and on the islands. And as someone from Dublin, as I was saying earlier, on the islands we have our traffic islands. So it's a real deep learning experience. We were on Bear Island last year, and again, taking away so many positives from that experience. Just to see, my role within Sinn Féin is as a community development spokesperson, and what I see on the islands is an incredible amount of community-led, community-supported development, and it's a real eye-opener to see how so much comes from the islands. So much support for each other, looking at new and innovative ways of how people can sustain themselves on the islands, how you can look at housing, look at biodiversity, look at tourism and the impact of tourism as well on the islands. So there's that sort of juggle between how do we get more people onto the island, to live on the island, to visit the islands, but at the same time, how do we protect the islands at the same time? And I think that's a real incredible struggle, and I see that coming from somebody who's coming from the outside. And I suppose it's just on the question I'd ask is around the challenges that you have as islands, as community, and looking at community-led projects, in ensuring that your voice is heard, and making sure that because you're so remote away from everything, from the mainland and from Dublin and from places where there is power, how do you get your voices heard? And how do you ensure that you get your voices heard in relation to just, whether it be biodiversity, whether it be tourism, whether it be, education, health, housing? I'd be very interested in that part.
Ms. Nishartik.
Thank you. So I suppose there's no getting away from it. It's exhausting, I suppose, to try and make yourself heard all of the time. I think we have to shout a lot louder on the islands, and we always feel, when we make it onto local radio or news, or that we're always giving out, we're always looking for more, we're always asking for more support, for more help, for more money, for more. And I hate to think that the islands, and I don't think they are, but I would hate to think that the islands would be seen as just a money pit, or that you're thinking. I think we actually have a something of value to offer, and you highlighted it there when you're saying about looking on islands at how to make ourselves sustainable, we can show really, really good examples of, be it how to tackle climate change, be it the effects of tourism, but it's always felt at a much smaller scale. But really, it's at this, it's works in very much the same way as what it would in any other area of the country. It's probably just felt a little bit earlier on the islands, and so we have something really valuable to offer in that sense. Connectivity on the islands is very, very important. I have worked from home, for example, since before the pandemic, before it was fashionable to do so, and I suppose a really, really good internet connection is vital in terms of being able to actually participate in a lot of meetings. So I'm very lucky that I'm able to join in today, while you're all in Árainn Mhór, from here in Inishmore in the Aran Islands, without being able to participate virtually in some meetings. it would make it impossible to, I suppose, stay informed, to stay on top of what is happening, what discussions are being had around different things that relate to the islands, that are important to the islands. Because we're dependent on a ferry that leaves at such and such a time, it often means a lot of travelling, a lot of overnight. And I think as islanders, we are used to that. We do put in the extra effort, we do stay, we do travel, but it is great to be able to have that connectivity as well. I think making sure that we participate in public consultations, that we're very active on that side, and to make sure that people are aware that we exist, that we're here, and making sure that we're fighting, I suppose, all the time to have an island perspective into all of the policies. I think it's fantastic that we finally have an interdepartmental policy for islands. I think it's a great start, and it's something that we can build on. And it means that there should now be a cohesive, I suppose, thinking between departments on how they tackle island issues, and departments working together, because the islands fall under multiple departments, and I think that's important to recognise. So we need to be able to make sure that all of those departments are working together, but in consultation with the island communities, because there's nobody is going to understand the issues that we face, the challenges that are unique to us, from the outside. So it's really, really important that islanders, I suppose, and communities are consulted, and that's a really important part of developing any new policies that are being made in relation to islands.
Thank you, Senator Burke. Yeah, Senator Burke, just the microphone.
Sorry, yeah. Like my other colleagues, I'm delighted to be here on this historic occasion, as well as the first broadcast from the islands. I'd just like to ask Avril, in relation to, you are the manager of the Aran Islands Energy Cooperative. That's obviously a new company, because energy is relatively new in the last number of years. Do you carry out the retrofitting and the installation of heat pumps or whatever to the houses on the islands? And if you do, have you carried out any surveys, we'll say, in relation to small wind turbines, domestic wind turbines? Because I think it's incredible that, from an Irish point of view, where we have wind in abundance and there is no small domestic wind turbines, or nobody seems to be championing these type of turbines, while there's lots of people championing the retrofitting and solar panels. In my view, and I have solar panels, I have a 6.5 kilowatt solar panels on my house, and I can tell you this, that a bad day is a bad day from an energy point of view, whether it's in the middle of summer or in the middle of winter. It's non-existent. And I think that we should be going down the route of small wind turbines, and we should be able to, as a nation, and I was just wondering, as you as an energy company, that have you any research done in relation to small wind turbines? Because if you look at the likes of Sweden and Switzerland, the solar panels are kind of non-existent in those countries, because they have nearly 6 months of darkness, and they have seen that they're not that much of a benefit to them. So I just wonder, have you any work done in relation to that?
Ms. Nishartik.
Thank you. Senator Burke, I hate to disappoint you, but the Energy Co-op, the Aran Islands Energy Co-op, is actually in its 11th year, or heading towards its 12th year now. We were established in 2012. And we were originally a group of islanders who, I suppose, had sat on various committees under the local development co-ops, but recognised that energy was something much wider that deserved, I suppose, an organisation of its own to focus on it as its primary concern. So we were established in 2012. We are open to our shareholders are only residents and businesses on the 3 Aran Islands. Membership in our cooperative is €100 for lifetime membership. And we have, I suppose, been looking at various different projects since 2012. We have originally, we would have been responsible for coordinating the retrofit of homes on the islands. We took part in a pilot scheme by SEAI in 2012, 2013. which was a pilot of their Better Energy Communities programme, which they later rolled out nationwide. And as part of that, I suppose we were the coordinators, so we project managed that at the time. That model was successful for us for a couple of years, but it also carried a huge amount of risk for a non-profit organisation with absolutely no income. We had a potential liability at one stage of over €1 million because we were we had the contract with SEAI. We were dependent on SEAI paying out the grant. If for any reason they didn't pay out a portion of the grant, we were left liable to pay the contractor. And similarly, we had the contract with the homeowners. And it left us wide open in terms of insurance, in terms of finances. It was just far too difficult for us to actually coordinate and project manage that as such a small organisation without the technical skill sets. I mean, we're not all engineers or anything sitting in on the board. And so we have since moved away from that model. So we recognised that we needed the people with the right skill sets to be leading these projects. We then, for a number of years, successfully ran the retrofitting programs with a contractor leading the application. So we did a lot of the background work and supported the contractor in making the application and collecting the information from all of the households and working very closely with both parties. And then they made the application directly to SEAI. That worked quite well, but then you're at the mercy of just one contractor. So then you start looking at you start running into issues maybe in terms of competition and eventually the contractor was no longer interested in working on the islands because it presented a lot more complications in terms of logistics, accommodation, travel to and from the islands and so on. So they chose not to submit an application for the island, and then we were left with nothing and looking for contractors that were willing to take on that role again, which wasn't easy. We found it much easier in 2012, 2013, 14 to get contractors out to the islands because it was post-recession, so there wasn't as much work happening on the mainland. Now that there's more of a shortage of construction workers on the mainland, it's getting harder and harder all the time to actually get those contractors onto the island. We have looked at different ways to mitigate against this, and we have taken part in an EU LIFE project called LEAP, which is just at the very, very beginning, the very early days. But through that project, we've actually established 3 separate energy agencies, one in Donegal, one in Sligo Leitrim, and one for the Comhar and the islands. The staff in that agency have just been appointed, so they're just in the very, very early days of that. But we are hoping that will be a solution. So these are people with the skills and the expertise to project manage these projects, and that we will be able to, I suppose, bundle the projects on the islands in with projects on the mainland and hopefully make it more enticing for contractors. So, I suppose that's our way of trying to tackle that issue. And then secondly, you asked about the small turbines on homes. So I agree. I think there's a huge opportunity for them. I think generally when we don't have a good sunshine in the winter months, in the leaner months, the turbines would work very well. I think there's room for both, for PV and smaller turbines, domestic turbines on homes. We have looked at this. I have actually seen an example of that in Ireland, but it's not on a house that's connected to the national grid. It's a totally off-grid home that uses PV and a small domestic wind turbine to power the home, along with battery storage, of course. And I think it's a really exciting thing to see working. My understanding is at the moment that it isn't possible to install it in your home if you're connected to the grid. You need to have a specific agreement in place with ESB Networks before you install anything like that onto their system. So you need there needs to be, I suppose, more work done on that side of it in order for people to actually be able to install technologies like that. They're not new, they're not experimental technologies. They work very, very well all over the world. So from that point of view, there's very little to investigate because we know that turbines work very well. We know that wind is a resource that we have in abundance on the islands and along the coast. And so really, I think that the work needs to be done on the other end of it to make it easier for people to install those technologies. There are distributors of small domestic turbines in the country already. So, you know, we are not that far off if the will was there to make it happen. And I agree. I think it's something that we should definitely be looking at.
Yeah, briefly, Senator.
You've said that there's no willingness to experiment with new technologies and that there is a blockage someplace. So where is the blockage? Is it with the CRU? Is it the ESB? Is it government? Or is it the department? Or where do you think that we could help maybe as a committee to put some pressure on where the blockages might be?
Ms. Nisharkik.
I think it's probably a combination. I think, you know, there seems to be a difficulty I have found in you know, the issue is we only have one DSO in the country. So when we want to try and ask them to trial new solutions on the islands, for example, in terms of our larger scale project, and in terms of looking at demand response and flexibility, I know ESBN are doing great things in terms of research and on the wider network. But it just seems to be maybe that the islands are so small that they don't seem to be interested in it. I just think that we have a really valuable thing to offer them in order to test these things at a small scale before it's scaled up. I think that needs to come from the top down. You know, even at a local authority level, it's very, very difficult sometimes to make changes. You know, so I think that needs to come from a very, very, very high level, that the will is there to bring more of these technologies into people's homes and to make it happen. So it moves further down the chain then in terms of making it easier to get the applications, in terms of finding installers. There's nothing to do, if you look at SEAI's website, there's no mention of domestic wind turbines on their pages. So if the only option for generating your electricity in your home on SEAI's website is PV. There's no other option there. So I think that needs to come from a very, very high level, that we don't just keep it very, very narrow and only just focus on certain technologies. We need to open it up a little bit more. And like I said, these aren't new technologies. It's not experimental. There isn't a huge risk associated with them. We know exactly how these things work. So it shouldn't take an awful lot to open it up and to inform more people about what's actually available.
Thank you. Senator Garvey.
Dave, befradan bheith an sin live bhí bheith agsúil go bhfuil chun dul ann ach tá orm bheith I Loch Ormond na Mórach go luair maidin well actually coming dul ann an bhróna aniu so ní raibh an bheith I gá áite an am céine ach befradan a bheith I inis mór I dún na gáil cá mé chuidhád am a saora I ina siar tá sé bhd níos cógardm howlí san Aran agus bhí sé an formí an idechas ó héamh na dúchláin atá san Oileán is mis an uair forber tuha son chuintas glas so tá alán dúchláin chéine ag an bhirtahín is socha tá mi sé machóní 5,000 ó siúpar bé na aonrad agus dín bus na aonrad a fáil ach so tá alán dúchláin similar ann ach tá sé níos deachar a gcuibse ná tá sé a gcuin so ní bhí mé gearán comór sa bhí mé hena féin mar ní mé machóní go thomláinte in Oileán. So yeah, tem de chas is so sin tá arágam. Nuair bhí mé in ina siar chud mé an rud fao dear bhí mé macóní mé fan le ben an ben is sinne ar an Oileán bhí an ómór am a bheith I tí Maggie Willie so an chas a formé uhi ó héh na dúhan agus an ahrú atá techt ar na Oileán agus le chud mé fao dear golóradí ó héh dúlan ó héh fuiineh ó héh dúlan ó héh waste dúlan ó héh connectivity ó héh broadband agus bhí an ahanagum ar dearm a loi fé blin ó héin agus an obair bhí á dhéanamh gé ó héh na Oileán a bheith níos nas blách inis mór go háirithe ó héh bí agus ó héh fuiineh ach fós tá sibh faoi bhagart I suppose really ó héh well túrasort nachhfuil cabhar leis an Oileán go thomláin I gceart agus an sin daoine cumad ar an Oileán agus na scoilna cumad oscailte. So níl sé éasca mar tá sé níos deachar a gachrad I dhéanamh ar Oileán. Tá sé deachar go leor duine áil chun aon rud a dhéisiú a thógáil a sa láthair so agus ní bhaid sé riomh éasca is cum a cad dhéanamhid Sin an dúna atá muinte na hián agus just tá mé bheith macánta faoi sin, you know. Tá mé smuoinú gohfuil sé antácht a gohfuil an finiú seo ag tarlú ar an cédal sios. Tá má grethir just ar what you call it, full disclosure, hosig sé is like those non-profits, Clear Community Energy Agency, agus tá sé faoi láthir ag opair le muintear inis Mhór ó HIVE, níos mó dhéanamh ó HIVE photovoltaic. Tá Senator Burke I gcónaí I gceart ach ó HIVE solar panels very useless nuair nach bhfuil ach solar sound sé ví sa bliain tá sé mí ceart faoi sin mar cad gafod bheith go mar dúirt an ben sin níor fuair a Avril mar dúirt sus a cad gafod bheith déanta agus ó HIVE wind turbines tá cuasa seachtain I San Alban agus fáil tú má chuir íann tú do domestic wind charger leat féin agus tá sé ró beag chud a bheith I the plan all of it a gut dahin was rinne fair céile ma drifóí agus cuir sé sús agus bhí solar, wind agus hydro acu actually agus bhí sé chuir stock sa grid so beidirhfuil níos mó taide bheith déanta faoi sin mar bhí sé na hain sé áile tre seachtain agus chuir sé chum sé wind charger féin, you know, rinne sé sús so bhí sé sin an simú because tá an méid the more independent people can be and the more upskilled they can be, the less they have to rely on people coming into the Ilan to fix things. If you build a wind charger yourself, a domestic one, the chances are you'll probably know how to fix it as well. You know, so there is that thing there. And I think upskilling, even for installing photovoltaic on roofs, if you have tradesmen on the island that are carpenters or roofers, I would love to be involved in, and I suppose I'm enterprise trade and employment spokesperson as well, so I'm working with apprenticeships and upskilling existing tradespeople to get workshops on the island to show them how to do that stuff themselves, because if you keep getting other people onto the island to do things, then anything goes wrong, you'd have to get them back again to fix it. So I'd love to see upskilling of existing islanders so they can do the work of putting the photovoltaic up, of knowing how to wire it. I'm sure there's electricians on some of the islands, and maybe it's islanders from other islands we should be upskilling. You can't have every trade on every island, but it would be interesting for me to see the upskilling of existing tradesmen from the islands and let them be the ones that get the gigs to go to islands to do the work if you don't have them on your own island. But that's something I'd love to work with you on the future. I've been meeting Niall Collins and Simon Harris about this thing of upskilling, and also with lots of islanders, you'd have people with 30 years experience maybe of carpentry or roofing or bricklaying, but maybe they never did the courses, and we need to get them recognised for prior learning skills so then they can take on apprenticeships and they can be the ones to get the grants to do the work. So sin a méid tá arágam fi láach tá mé anbhónach nach bhfuil mé hinine this morning of tá mé hétí bailach lia ó chón ó chón.
Thank you, Ms. Nishartik.
Yeah, gur míle mágat mar Roisin Garabílan in sin, so tá golóir obair ar buna an faoi láthid a chuid peann lecha PV isteach, so bhí colm Garabí bhí seamó ar na Hilan I donna obairlinn faoi láthid agus tá na peann lecha PV atá agan in sear na Hilan tá sé a gobar th bar tá chulachan tá sé dagab tá sé an sástalop ach tuigim céirt atá Senator Burke a rácha má faoi ní freagra na ceiste ar fad an a PV panels in áide. Béir dhéad ag tastal ach tá áit acab sa mathematics géar an fuineh in anúte úsáid tá béis a fíorthábhachtach creidim. Mar deir tú ní bhéradí a riomh éasca in na Hilan ach stoi go muinte na Hilan is even linn an áte táid na marachta. So táid sásta an ábir sin nach chuisteach, táid sásta chuirmuid sús le méid áid ach just tasting beganín takeíocht leradí I gceanna níos fearr agus go gunneomid sús leis a chuid eile an tír. The EU, I suppose, recognises the importance of islands, the importance of giving specific support to islands. There's a Clean Energy for EU Islands Secretariat, which looks at islands all over Europe. We have published a Clean Energy Transition Agenda with the Secretariat. We were one of 6 pilot islands chosen to participate in the first round. They've moved on to the next phase, so they are now supporting community groups with their energy projects. We have benefited from support, technical support from the Clean Energy for EU Island Secretariat in the past. And we're hoping that we will be able to benefit again in the future now as they're launching their third phase. But I think that the fact that the EU sees fit to support islands specifically, to create island-specific supports, I feel that the Irish government should be able to do something similar, that there should be additional funding, additional supports available to islands to carry out this work that maybe isn't available on the mainland, because maybe it isn't as needed on the mainland as it is on islands. We see examples of it all over Europe, where the governments and the EU in general provides additional support, that they focus on islands, they recognise how important the islands are, and what the value that they hold. And then they choose to provide island-specific supports. And I think that if we were able to combine the EU supports that are available with national supports that are specific for islands in terms of the energy transition, then we would have the opportunity to really make some changes and to meet our targets, more importantly, I suppose.
Thank you, Ms. Nisharki. A couple of questions I just want to put to you. And the first one is, you pointed out in your opening statement that the retrofitting of homes has had an impact in terms of improving the living conditions of older people, and that it has improved their health and well-being. And as we know, the Department of the Environment, Climate and Communications commissioned the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine to do an assessment of the deep retrofitting of homes in Ireland, and found that people have improved health outcomes. They're attending their GP less when they're being prescribed less antibiotics. They're being admitted to hospital less. When they're being admitted to hospital, they're being discharged far quicker. I'm just wondering, in terms of the work that you've done on the islands, have you seen anecdotal evidence of that, the impact that it has, particularly in relation to older people and in terms of chronic conditions? Because managing chronic conditions is difficult across this country, but it's far more difficult when you look at island communities in terms of getting specialist appointments, etc. And if you just comment on that. Secondly, maybe you just might give us an idea of the impact of engaging with Horizon researchers, the fact that you're engaging with the research community in terms of the projects that you're involved with on the islands. What sort of an impact has that, being able to engage directly with them? And on that issue, you've spoken about the challenges in terms of the Community When project and your limited ability to export electricity onto the mainland grid, and the issues and complexities with regard to battery storage. Have any of the research projects looked at using smart storage heaters in homes? I know this is a technology that has been developed here in Ireland by a number of companies. I know that they are rolling it out in other parts of Europe, but has there any engagement been done in relation to that? Because you have an isolated grid on an island community. It seems to me to be an ideal testbed for it. And just very finally then, I think an issue for us as members of the committee here, it's very clear that there are challenges in terms of getting projects off the ground, in terms of the flexibility and adaptability being provided through the regulatory environment. And I think there is an opportunity for us as a committee to engage with the Commission for the Regulation of Utilities to see if they would take a more flexible approach, facilitate pilots in relation to the island communities that then could be upscaled and replicated across the country as a whole. And if you'd like to comment on that suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in terms of anecdotal evidence, I suppose from retrofitting homes and the outcomes there, I think it comes down very, very simply even to making homes warmer, insulating them. So a lot of the time in, not just on islands, but in rural communities, those who are in fuel poverty are living in maybe older stone-built homes. They're very, very difficult to insulate. They're very, very difficult to heat. As the cost of energy rises, carbon taxes are coming in. They become more and more expensive to heat because the heat is just escaping completely out, so quickly out of the homes. So a lot of the time, when we look at retrofitting homes and we're talking about insulating or installing heat pumps, even just the simple thing of not having to lug coal in and out to put it on a solid fuel fire, for somebody who's older, that makes life easier straight away if you're not having to worry about doing that, going in and out in the wintertime, lugging in buckets of coal. It's not easy to retrofit a lot of these stone built homes and older houses. So there's a huge challenge, not just on islands or in rural communities, but nationwide. But there is definitely any of the older people I have met who have had work done on their homes, who have had them retrofitted, are very, very happy generally, and that their homes are more comfortable as a result, which is a fantastic thing. There's a huge learning curve, I suppose, as well, because these technologies work very differently to what people may be used to, not just for older people, but for everybody. So I think there's a big role there for contractors who are installing things into people's homes, that they ensure that people understand how they work, how they run. You can't turn a heat pump on and off like you did your oil boiler. It doesn't work that way. You're supposed to leave it on constantly, and it does its own thing. It's not, so people getting this technology for the first time may not understand exactly how to run it most efficiently. And I think that is very important as well, because you don't want people having this technology installed and then having really, really high energy bills as a result, and not understanding why, because they're not using the technology properly. So that's really, really important as well. In terms of the engagement with the Horizon researchers, we have found that to be transformative for our cooperative. For a start, we don't receive any kind of core funding from the government or from any national agency. So all of our funding really for all of our work comes through our engagement with the Horizon Research Project. They create a lot of work on their own as well, but they're I suppose aligned with our aims and objectives and with what we're trying to achieve. So unfortunately, we haven't engaged in a project looking at smart storage heaters. It's something that we're trying to do, but we have to work with other agencies and other universities in order to submit these applications. So we're not really in a position to submit them ourselves or to lead them ourselves. And so we are always trying to look for projects that are aligned with our own aims and objectives, and with looking at different technologies that could be installed and trialled on the islands or piloted. We have looked at other smart solutions, like I mentioned earlier. There was a demand response project, but we haven't not looked at the smart storage heaters in terms of Horizon research. We are, I suppose, very lucky that we engage with a lot of these projects. We learn an awful lot. So we're not experts. I'm not an engineer. We don't have backgrounds in that area. So being able to work with them and learn from them is massive. And I think it's fantastic that there is a role for non-profit groups or community groups in Horizon Research, as well as from universities, as well as people from the commercial sector as well. So we've learned a tremendous amount from all of the different partners that we've had across all of the different research projects we've been involved in to date. And then when it comes to the replication, I suppose, of when it comes to, I suppose, engaging with the CRU and using the islands as an area to replicate smart solutions, I really, really think that that's going to be hugely important. We talk about our aims to be lighthouse communities, or lighthouse islands for other islands and other communities. I think there's a huge opportunity there, and I think that that's something that the CRU should be looking at, giving us a little bit more flexibility in terms of working with us. We probably don't understand all of the issues that are involved, but it would be great to be able to work with them and to learn and to try and make suggestions, and then to see exactly what can be done and to be a little bit more flexible on it. I think that this is something that they're going to have to look at sooner rather than later. The intermittency of renewables across the country as we move to renewables and as we eliminate fossil fuels is going to cause huge issues. It's going to be a significant complication. It's going to be a lot of work for the CRU and for all of the other stakeholders involved. So I think there's definitely a real opportunity for them here if they are willing to trial these technologies on our islands and scale it up, because we operate, the grid here is an isolated part of the national grid. It operates in exactly the same way. So I think we actually have something to offer, as opposed to just looking for something all the time. We do actually have something to offer in return in that way.
Thank you. I think you have an awful lot to offer, and I want to thank you, Ms. Nishartik, for your presentation this morning to the committee, and it is a matter that we will be taking up again. We now move to the second topic on our agenda, which is housing and sustaining communities on our offshore islands. I'd like to welcome to the meeting today one of the authors of a new report on this topic, Dr. Conor Cashman from University College Cork School of Applied Social Science. The report was commissioned by nOileán, and we're joined this morning by nOileán, CEO of nOileán, and Nóirín Wade Dunnig, the Banastor, Comhar, Aran, Mhór, a member of Comhar and Árainn Cho. You're all very welcome here this morning, and now invite Dr. Cashman to make his opening statement.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Chairperson, Deputies and Senators, and it is very much an honour to be here today to speak with you about sustaining housing and communities on Ireland's offshore islands. And as you mentioned, I'm joined by Moira and Nóirín as well. I'll just give a very brief opening statement to set out the research that was carried out by myself and Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan of the School of Applied Social Studies in UCC. The research, as mentioned, focused on housing needs on Ireland's offshore islands. I think it's important to state from the outset and to acknowledge the timeliness of this research in terms of the context in which it took place. Obviously, there's an urgent need to address identified housing needs on the islands. And there's also an opportunity presented by the recent publication of the government's Living Islands national policy and the related action plan. I think it's also important to stress from the outset that the research that myself and my colleague Siobhan O'Sullivan carried out, it highlights that there is a strong wish by full-time residents and communities to remain living and thriving on the islands. There's also a clear cohort of people who want to return to or move to the islands for the first time. And in this regard, the research and the survey, it underscores how housing is crucial in this respect, for both maintaining and expanding communities on Ireland's offshore islands. And while the housing situation on the islands is situated in the context of a wider housing crisis in Ireland generally, the needs, preferences and experiences set out in the upcoming report highlight that a failure to address housing needs on the islands represents an existential threat to the continuity of sustainable communities on those islands. So again, we can talk a bit more of the report in a few moments if you want to ask specific questions, but just kind of key points, I suppose. 611 people participated in the survey. It was done online. 60% of all survey respondents were full-time residents on the Irish offshore islands. Second homeowners accounted for 21% of total responses received. 13% of respondents had previously lived on the islands, and a lot of those indicated a wish to return back to the islands. And then 6% of responses from people who needed to or wished to move to the islands full-time. And perhaps reflecting the population size of the offshore islands, Galway Islands region accounted for 44% of the responses received, followed by Cork of 31%, Donegal 14%, and Mayo 11%. I'm happy to talk, as will Nóirín and Moira, about the specific details later on this morning, but just some key issues that have arisen from the survey and from the kind of draft recommendations that we're putting forward at the moment. First of all, the key issue really is there's a lack of affordable and available housing. This is a significant issue impacting respondents to the survey who wish to remain on or move to the islands. So a key issue here in terms of the actual cost and affordability of homes, as well as the availability. There's also an issue around the lack of long-term available rental accommodation, and renters are facing a particularly precarious experience and living situation on Ireland's Irish islands, or offshore islands, I should say, and it's demonstrated in the report. Also, just a key point, and maybe this is something we could flesh out more in questions, the most popular or most preferred property and tenure type that survey respondents identified is a mortgage, or a house owned outright, I should say, or owned with a mortgage. And there's a key point here about the nature of affordability on Ireland's offshore islands, which is something that needs to be perhaps discussed and tackled. As I mentioned a second ago, the precarity of renters and the lack of a long-term sustainable renting option is particularly obvious in the research that myself and Siobhan carried out. 79% of renters in the survey stated that they were likely or very likely to need to move in the next 5 years. And the majority of these people want to remain on the offshore islands. They want to remain living in their homes or on the islands. But there's a significant concern expressed by renters about the security of tenure and having to vacate their home due to the sale or landlord requesting to move out or having to move out during the holiday season. Okay. Another point to note is that there's a latent housing demand. In addition to people who want to live here and remain living here who are full-time residents, there's also an interesting insight from their survey as people who want to move back to the islands, if you previously lived here, people who want to move to the islands for the first time. And it's interesting that language and culture is identified as one of the reasons what has drawn people to the islands who may not have lived here previously. So just an interesting kind of qualitative insight into the reasons that people set out. And then just another key issue is there's very, very strong support for schemes and initiatives that enable sustainable communities. This includes in particular community-owned or island-run housing schemes that will address specific island issues. The conversion of derelict properties. This is seen as, and it's a terrible phrase perhaps to use in terms of housing, but derelict properties are seen as an untapped asset that could be used to particularly accommodate people who have a long-term housing need on the island, or perhaps young people who want to start families on the island, etc. Making planning permission more achievable and accessible is also highlighted by respondents. And there's also support for things like rural resettlement funds and gateway housing. So I'm conscious of the time, so I'll just very quickly say there's a number of recommendations in the report which will be published shortly. But just when we were coming up with the recommendations and discussing it with the group, etc., we want to ensure that the voices of survey respondents are heard, but also grasp the opportunity that the Islands policy published recently provides us as well. So some kind of 5 key recommendations emerge. First of all, there should be specific island metrics gathered. Okay, so we know what the actual needs are of each individual island region. Different island regions have different specific needs when it comes to housing. So these should be actually monitored and maintained and be identified through ongoing engagement with island communities. There's strong support and strong recommendation coming for the creation of a community-led housing association or an approved housing body. This could be managed by communities on the islands, and this could also be provided with a remit to provide affordable gateway or sheltered housing options for full-time residents, new residents, and essential workers, which I think might fit in with some of Ms. Nisharki's comments earlier on as well. Again, this is already discussed in some detail in the policy and the action plan. The question is how it should operate. And again, happy to talk about this. There's also an important role to be played for island representative groups such as Comhar or Cogal to give input around the formation of planning guidelines. This is crucial in terms of people having the opportunity to set out their experience and issues that they're experiencing with planning permission on the Irish Islands. The 4th recommendation is the need to have input around the implementation of policy on vacant homes, particularly around the identification of properties, the nature of such schemes that might be available to residents, and often people express difficulties around dealing with bureaucracies and assessing ownership and title of properties, etc. And then finally, like every good researcher, the final point is we need to have more research and ongoing research as well. That's kind of a key point to make sure that there's continuous engagement with communities on this point. Just one final point, I might just slightly go off script because I just want to say this because I thought it kind of rings true. In the survey that we're always going to launch shortly, we asked people for their open text or free text. They can put in certain information as they want. And just I thought one person said, because people experience survey fatigue, they're asked a lot of things all the time. But one person said, I hope something comes of this survey. As a young adult, there is no housing available on the island that is my home. And that kind of cuts through because he's talking about housing, which is kind of like an asset, but it's actually people's home as well, and that needs to be addressed. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Deputy O'Keefe, first.
Yeah. I'd like to thank you for the paper and research, and I think it's well recognised by the islanders that housing is a major issue. And you've given an even better insight into it. Now, my experience is that when you look at people who apply on their own sites or who acquire a site, for islanders who can establish housing need, the problem seems to be wastewater archaeology, ecology, etc. And they have to be all taken in one by one. Wastewater disposal, for example, in the Aran Islands is a major, major issue at the moment, but it needs a technical solution and an agreed technical solution to overcome it. On the housing need one, and this goes to the planning, There are 4 different councils that approach it 4 different ways. In other words, you've got Donegal, Mayo, Galway and Cork. And my view is that we need clear national guidelines. And what I have been suggesting, I'd be interested in your response on this, is that anybody who has lived full-time, in other words, basic residence, place of residence where they have their vote, where they're living, is on an offshore island, should be deemed to have a social and economic connection with the island. And as long as they can prove within reason, that they're likely to remain, that they haven't done it solely for the purpose of getting a planning permission and then having a holiday home. Now, I think we need to set that out fairly clearly, that that is the way, because I have seen people who have been 6 and 7 years in Ireland and still running into trouble, as that they're not, they don't qualify for housing need. That covers the main issue we're coming up against for non-islanders trying to settle on islands permanently. And they might be teachers, they could be anybody on an island with very good jobs, but they can't get the housing need. Now, as well as that, I agree with you about the AHB, but the AHB would have to be a different type of AHB than we're familiar with. It would not just be affordable housing and social housing. It would have to include just ordinary purchase housing for those who have got better jobs than that and just want to avail under the schemes. And my suggestion is that one suggestion I'd add to, most of the islands, with the exception of Inishbofin and Galway, the Mayo Islands and all the Cork Islands except for Ilan, but the rest, all the Donegal Islands and the 3 Aran Islands, which population-wise is the vast majority of the island, come under Údarás. My view is, because of their economic ability, their organisation ability, that they should be part of setting up this AHB and central to it, because there's no point in reinventing the wheel, and you're better using the agents we have that are strong. My final point would be, and these are all just practical things you can do and do now. I'm always looking for the things you can get on with and get done that would make a significant difference, is that it would become automatic that all schemes, the housing aid for older people, the mobility grants, the adaptation grants, the Crecona, we do get an extra top up, and the help to buy, and any other scheme that comes in the future that gives assistance to people in the mainland, that automatically there would be a 30% top up on the island rate because of the extra cost of transport, of bringing, and like people underestimate the transport difficulty, because you bring it, there's a row here, and there's row in Bear Island. The rest is low, and you bring it to the pier. You have to load it on the boat. When you get it off the boat at the other end, you unload it, and you have to transport it. So you need 2 motor vehicles, one at each end. So it's a lot more expensive. It's not just the freight cost of the boat. Even if you eliminated that in total, it doesn't solve the problem. There is still a lot more handling, and handling is money. So they would be, what I get from your document and what work I've been doing myself, would be, I'd be interested in the response as to whether you think that they would make a significant start in trying to move forward. We know where we'd like to be, but we need to get there. And finally, on some of the islands, Údarás would be, if we amended the Act slightly, and that's the job for the Coiste Gaeilge, if we amend the Act slightly, they should be able to use the land they own and other lands they might buy for housing as well as for industrial purposes.
Dr. Cashman, do you want to start off there?
Yeah, thank you very much, Deputy Queeve, and Gamaleshka, nOileán, Gaeilge. Certainly with regard to the planning, and I'll just make a few brief points, obviously Nori before I want to talk as well, but just to say, yes, certainly we did ask people about planning. Planning is a key issue that people have identified as a barrier to potentially remaining on the island. Just looking at the kind of draft figures here from the report, one of the key reasons for planning refusal was the site being in a SAC or a national area of protection. Now, the one point that goes back to some of the recommendations from the report is we need to understand the specific reasons across different island regions. Some islands may have this as a big issue, some don't, so hence, but that's clearly a key point. And we do recommend that there's input and acknowledgement into the national planning guidelines to be able to respond to people's needs with regard to planning permission. Affordability, I think, is a key point as well, and I think you're exactly right around how that should be formed. particularly around, if you look at some of the figures that we've managed to get, people talk about they could afford houses up to approximately €200,000, which does not meet the market level that would be in some of the islands. So there needs to be a kind of an acknowledgement and flexibility. I think the Cooperative was mentioning flexibility in other schemes. Flexibility in AHBs that might be established for the islands that would acknowledge this, obviously subject to prudential regulations and whatever else regulatory authorities the AHBs need to be aware of. Certainly the Críocóna is another point which I think nOileán might have a couple of comments in terms of using and actually accessing those services as well. But yes, I thank you for those comments.
On the Críocóna.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all here to our Mhór Island as an islander. It's a great privilege for us to have you present here today, and it's a huge body of work. You can see that getting this all set up in the room next door as well. So thank you very much, and thanks for giving us the opportunity. The Críocóna, we do welcome the Críocóna scheme. And with the extra top-up, we do have a significant number of derelict vacant houses here on the island, but there is a problem that many face, that the ownership, the title, a lot of them would have to go back a few generations to be able to establish the ownership now, and the cost associated with that would be, very prohibitive for a lot of people. It would be very expensive. It goes 2 generations to get the title, to get the property in the first place. There is another issue it's a minor issue, I suppose, but community groups such as ourselves, we would have bought lands and bought property over the years. Our co-op was established since the 1970s, and back many years ago they had purchased lands, for development works. But we find now that there might be derelict houses on some of those properties. You cannot get the Críocóna. You can't qualify for the Críocóna if the property is not in the name of an individual. A community group cannot avail of it. So that's all I'd have to say about the Críocóna, but it would be very, very helpful if community groups could apply for it.
I think that's a very simple suggestion. I think it's one that the committee could take up with the Minister. Marge, do you want to come in, or we go to... Do you want... Deputy Donnelly is next.
I suppose a couple of issues I'd like to address. One is around the AHBs. I think we'd have a lot of experience in my constituency around AHBs, and they are buying and building vast numbers of homes, and we've seen how it's worked in the area. So I think it is a really good suggestion, and I think I like the idea of that it's community basis coming from the islands itself, because you are the ones who understand and acknowledge what the difficulties are, what the challenges are, and all of that. One of the things I think we need to look at is around new technologies when we're talking about new homes. The traditional house where it's block built, or I think we need to have a look at, because of the issue around construction workers, and again trying to get construction workers, as we talked about earlier on, how do we get construction workers on here, the expense and all that. A lot of these new technologies now that we've looked at is they're built off-site, and they're built in factories. They don't need that highly skilled set of construction workers on site, and they can be moved and constructed in a very, very rapid period. I mean, there's one I visited recently, and it's going up in the next few months. It'll take 3 months for a 6-block apartment to be built. It's all built off-site, and it'll take 3 months to install it. And I think that's something that really needs to be looked at. The other thing is around, and I think it's a really important issue, because it's around cost rental and on affordable rental or affordable homes. Because if we were to look at cost rental and putting the cost of it onto the individual, then it becomes unaffordable. And there is no point in doing that. We have to make homes affordable for people. And also looking at the public housing aspect of it as well is extremely important, so that people who can't afford and who will never be able to afford to get a mortgage, or even under an affordable scheme, that they're given an opportunity to live on the islands as well. Just a quick one. I wonder, have we ever looked at under-occupied houses? And I know in my constituency the council will look at people who are in maybe a 3-bedroom or a 4-bedroom home. The family have all grown up and moved out. It's under-occupied. And I think there is an opportunity in the planning laws to look at maybe allowing somebody to build a home that's going to release a bigger home so that a family could move into it, something like that, so that we can release them, because there is an awful lot of people who would like to move from that bigger home because of the cost of running a 3 or 4 bedroom house as opposed to a 1-bedroom house. That suits their needs now as it stands. And just in terms of the planning and second homes, holiday lets, whatever you want to call them, do we know exactly how many holiday lets would be on average, or maybe like take this island? Do we know exactly how many are in relation to the number of houses that are on the island itself? Because again, that's the impact. And you mentioned one part which is puzzling me is around people who are currently letting, you talk about security of tenure. My understanding, again, it could be wrong, but my understanding is that there are four conditions where a person can get a property back from a renter. I didn't know holiday let was one of those. I wonder, could you just elaborate on that one?
So, Mr. Cashman, or Dr. Cashman, do you want to start off, and maybe the other witnesses might want to come in then?
Thanks very much. Just the survey asked people's experience and list of reasons as to why the security of tenure isn't ideal, and so we weren't asking people, did a landlord give you a legally justified reason to do, but it's just this is people's experience that they don't feel they have a long 12-month or X number of years security of tenure. That was one of the main points, but I think the biggest point with the rent precarity of renters was also just that, more than on Ireland generally, a landlord's thinking of selling, people getting out of the market, that kind of concern. So that was one. That's just on that point. I think there's definitely more work to be done in terms of particularly looking at the CSO figures around vacancy and derelict properties, as well as level of occupancy. So that's certainly something that could be a kind of a live, continued piece of research. And then again, just on and I hope I came across properly in this in the kind of the opening statement. There's a key issue about affordability and what that looks like on Ireland's offshore islands. And I think in terms of, the previous speaker mentioned this as well, there has to be willingness to address this, and a kind of a political will to address this in terms of what an AHB should do if it has island communities' needs in mind, particularly when people may not be in a social housing list, but they can't meet market prices for property on the islands. But I'm conscious I'm talking an awful lot, so I don't want to take up everyone's time.
Just on some of those points, just on a few of those, thanks everyone for inviting us. It's a great opportunity, and it's fantastic that it's on one of the Irish islands. Just on your point about the under-occupied houses, I think there would be a huge opposition to that on the islands. The homes, land and homes are, they belong to the family, the extended family, and that's very important. They often go to extended family. An island person would never think of selling their home, and it just wouldn't happen, unfortunately, but that's the way it is. Just on the question of AHBs for Ireland, it's a really good idea, and to get them involved in that, we'll certainly be talking to them, but we'd still have maybe an issue with the non-Gaeltacht islands if Údaras were involved there, but there might be something that could be piloted with Údaras and then, extended in some way. The problem with security of tenure and renting and all that, often there are no contracts in place. The islanders are a bit slow at introducing documents into arrangements. I think everyone will kind of understand that. So that can be a huge issue. Planning and SSEs, and I think the big issue we have is with that local authorities' willingness to engage, really, I suppose. That's the one of the huge issues we have. And just on that, I think that's where we could get the assistance of, you know, yourselves as the legislature of the country to, you know, look at that whole point about local authorities and how they are engaging with local people. Surely there is, you know, a time when, you know, the environment is extremely important, and nobody values the environment as much as islanders do. And some of the islands, everything you see is man-made, and they are islands. And you know, diversity and the caretaking of the land and everything is what makes them special. And therefore, you know, people are a crucial point in that as well. And we have to take care of our population. Otherwise, really, you'll have wilderness that is not good for diversity either. Thank you.
Ms. Niguay-Donoghue, do you want to come in there?
Just in relation to holiday lets being introduced as housing stock, and we would have significant holiday homes here. Probably a quarter of the properties on the islands would be holiday homes, but they wouldn't be suitable for long-term lets. They would be owned by islanders who live and work elsewhere in the country or overseas, but they would be inclined to use them very much themselves throughout the year, so they wouldn't be probably suitable for residential properties for people wanting to move to the islands.
Thank you. Deputy O'Cossie.
Here, like we don't have islands in Waterford, but we have very similar pressures, I think, in our Gaeltacht community in Waterford as well, in Gaeltacht and Naoise, where you have those kind of competing demands. You have a lot of properties that are being used as second properties or holiday homes. You have the situation where people who want to live and work within their own Gaeltacht community find it extremely difficult to access housing because of the price. They're simply priced out of the market. Whenever, on the rare occasion that a house comes up for sale, the property tends to be unaffordable to people who are working within the community. So it's a very similar situation. Really jumped out at me that issue around community groups not being able to access the Creek Conaha. And what I was thinking straight away, something that has worked very well in Waterford and Waterford City, is the repair and lease scheme. I don't know if, because that would provide for that social housing to enter into the mix. I don't know if that's something that you've explored and investigated, and whether, it's a genuine question, I don't know whether community groups can access that. Dr. Cashman, I'm very struck that your 5 key recommendations they're fairly close to a number of the recommendations in the action plan for the Our Living Islands. So I might ask you to comment on that. I do very much support Deputy O'Keefe in that call for the remit of Údarás na Gaeltachta to be expanded to allow for that kind of community-based AHB model. I mean, they have the land and they have the knowledge and the expertise, but I do think, as Missy Niguay-Donoghue said, it would be important not to forget the non-Gaeltacht islands in that, and I think it would be, I know Deputy O'Keefe, you've mentioned this, it wouldn't be beyond the pale of possibility for the remit of Údarás na Gaeltachta to be expanded that slight bit to include non-Gaeltacht islands, whether that would be doable or not. But yeah, so on that specific issue, whether you've investigated the repair and lease, and maybe just if you could give us a bit of local context, because Dr. Cashman presented in general, but I know that each island is different and the pressures on housing are different, and I suppose how maybe Inisheer would compare to Árainn Mhór in terms of the specific housing needs or the differences that exist there.
Ms. Niguay-Donoghue, I think you've got some specific questions, so I might ask you to come in first.
In relation to the scheme, no, we haven't considered that, no, and we haven't investigated it, but it's something that we certainly can. In relation to our own island, well, I suppose the islands, all the islands are different, but I think when it comes to housing, I think all the islands are the same. The issues are the same. Ourselves here, we do know that a significant amount of people would like to come and live here. There was a 3 campaign a number of years back, and a lot of people were expressing interest in moving to the island. The problem was the lack of housing for sale, lack of housing for rent. You know, so we do know, as well as that a lot of people returned to the islands during COVID. But in order for us to, I suppose, make sure we can sustain our communities, we are going to have to address the issue of lack of housing for people. Non-islanders want to come back, and islanders who emigrate and want to come back and build a house, as I did myself. Many people on this island have had the same pattern, moving to England or to America and returning and building on their own lands. And what was very, very good a number of years back, until it ended in 2008 with Bode Snipnua, when the housing grant, the grant to build a house, that ended on the island. So that was a very, very beneficial thing. That it would be very beneficial if it could be reinstated. As relation to the differences in issues for NSTS, from where would
Mr. NOileán, do you want to come in there?
I suppose on Inisheer and the Aran Islands in general, I think we don't have a huge problem with dereliction. So there'll be very little take-up of that Comhar grant. On another point, the repair and lease scheme. One of the big issues that we came across is we don't have an awful lot of people who are on the islands who are on housing lists. You know, they're just not on it. I don't think, is there anyone from this island? No, and we may have two on the island I'm on. So the repair and lease scheme is when you avail of the grant and you lease it to the local authority for a long period of time. Now, the period of time is too long anyway. I think that would put a lot of people off. But then it has to be available to people who are on the housing list and who are availing of HIVE. And we don't have a lot of those. So that's one of the, I suppose, that's an area we differ in as in comparison to mainland areas.
Dr. Cashman.
Sorry, it's going green and going red. There we go. Sorry. Thanks very much, Deputy. Yeah, just on the fact that the recommendations are very close to the recommendations in the action plan. We did this. The survey was carried out towards the end of last year, and we were drafting, analysing the data, and talking to people, etc., about the recommendations or findings really from the research. And then when we saw when the action plan and policy was launched, we felt obviously it's an important opportunity to kind of see what overlaps are there in terms of what voices of islanders are saying and how this might map with the action plan. I think the specific point though from the survey and the kind of recommendations are that there needs to be a specific island-based action plan and metrics as well that might sit under the action plan or the policy from government. Because I think, as is maybe demonstrated, yes, there is a unique set of challenges around housing on Ireland's offshore islands, but then there's different experiences in different areas too, you know, which people can speak to. So, for example, maybe the dereliction isn't a huge issue in some of the Galway Islands, but from the report, rental precarity seems to be very, very high in the Galway Island regions, more so than others, perhaps. And what we'll do in the final published report, we have information sheets that sets out the different kind of experiences across the 4 different regions that emerged. All anonymous information, of course, but just to kind of get a sense of that. But the action plans that we have set out, myself and Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, focuses on, you know, really community-engaged responses and people are being listened to, so that the action plan isn't just a nice PDF that sits on a shelf. That people actually will enact these things, particularly local groups. Yeah,
thank you. Senator Burke.
Thanks, Comhar. Look, I'd like to congratulate the witnesses in relation to the great research and surveys that they have done in relation to the offshore islands. I think Deputy O'Keefe has raised a very good point there in relation to four different counties with 4 different planning authorities. And I think what needs to be done is that an umbrella body would need to develop some form of a policy, and then it could be given to the 4 different local authorities that they would adopt in their county development plans, as it's the members of the local authorities that adopts county development plans. So if you wanted something uniform right across the islands or offshore islands, then you'd have to get something like that, I would think, stitched into the local authorities' plans, and I think that would probably be a way of doing it. I'm sure that a special case can be made for the Comhar for community groups, particularly for the offshore islands. And I think that the local authorities, if you had a problem getting the title for the properties, that the local authorities could play a big role in relation to doing a CPO, if there was agreement all around. Because the local authority can do a CPO, and then they could hand it back to the community group. Thanks, Chairman.
Thanks. Wish you the best luck getting the local authorities to act on CPOs. But anyway, maybe Dr. Cashman, do you want to comment first?
Powers they have, anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you very much, Senator Burke. Yeah, I mean, we have recommended, and again, the voice of the people who filled out the survey, and you know, there's clearly frustration with planning processes generally, not just not getting planning permission approved, but just the bureaucracy of dealing with. This is the voice of what's coming across in the survey. So certainly there is a case to be made for far more engagement with community residents to have a voice in planning guidelines. How that would work in reality, particularly with the local authorities, that's another question. And I think the rural guidelines are currently being published. I'm not sure they've been published as of yet. But that's certainly an issue. And just, you know, again, maybe Moira has more to speak on this. But in terms of just not being able to get proper answers or relatively quick turnaround times in terms of applications or just how the application is progressing, that's a key frustration. And there's a huge cost as well that residents talk about too.
Thanks. Senator Garvey. Senator Garvey. Deputy O'Keefe, you had a question there if you wanted to come in, and we'll bring Senator Garvey in after that then.
I want to support what Moira said about under-occupied houses. And there's a total misunderstanding, in my view, in Urban Ireland about this. I live most of the time in an under-occupied house. No question doubt about it. Except when the children come home and they bring their children and others, the grandchildren come home, and then we're in an over-occupied house and the whole place is full. And that happens summer, it happens at bank holiday weekends, it happens in the Christmas and so on. So you actually find there's very few rural houses that are empty all the year, even where they're under-occupied. Because when I was growing up, I lived in Dublin, and we never stepped over. There's no point, all our relations were nearby. But when your family comes home to a rural area, they obviously stay with the parents and so on in a lot of cases. One of the problems we have continuously, particularly in Galway, and I don't know if it's true in Donegal and Mayo and Cork, is it's very hard to get a pre-planning meeting. But more importantly, if I refuse, it's very hard to get a post-planning meeting so that you can go in and meet the planner and find out exactly what changes you'd have to make to get it the second time. And people are spending a lot of money trying to address the issues, and they're finding out they're still getting refused. And I think that that's a problem. And finally, the Udras Act is being amended at the moment. It's in the process. And my view is that a provision could be put in there that certain functions at the direction of the minister could be carried out by the Udras on an agency basis on specifically non-Gaeltacht islands. Because the non-Gaeltacht islands population-wise are about a quarter of the total island population. And when we set up, when initially the Gaeltacht and the islands was put into one department, the idea was that you could treat islands for socio-economic matters exactly the same, whether they were Gaeltacht or non-Gaeltacht. We need to have the same power now to get on with the job. And to set up an AHB that could buy and sell land, that would have the power to do that. The Title 1, Noreen, we put an airstrip in Inishbofin. And one of the, it had to be CPO'd and was commonage. And one of the interesting byproducts of that is that for people to get their money, they had to get title, and some of them used all of the money they got for the CPO to get the titles up to date, which was very useful for farming purposes and ownership purposes. So I do agree, where it hasn't happened now, I think in most of the island it has happened because of farming grants. But where it hasn't happened, I do think we need to look and quantify it. So I'd be interested to find out how many landholders on the island, just roughly speaking, would not have clear title to all of the properties, their land and their buildings.
Deputy Donnelly.
Yeah. Sorry, just to clarify, the under-occupancy or over-occupancy is entirely voluntary. So in our local authority, it's if a person chooses to downsize, to choose on, there is nothing compulsory about this. So just to clarify that, it's not about forcing people out of their homes and into smaller homes. It is entirely, people are choosing to do that. And I think there should be an option somewhere where people, if they wish to choose to move to a smaller property, then that option is open there for them as well.
Thank you. Ms. nOileán, Donny, you might come in first on Deputy O'Cui's last question in particular in terms of these properties where there's complexities in relation to title, because it's definitely an issue I'm finding in my own constituency in relation to it. But if we had a scale of the problem, it might help us to actually progress it on any of the islands here or wherever.
Well, we haven't done an analysis of the amount of properties, but we do know we have a significant amount of derelict properties. The number that haven't got title, we haven't analysed that as yet. But I do think with this report, just going back to the report itself and the findings and the recommendations, I do think it's very, very useful. I think it's going to be a great tool for us moving forward, together with some of the suggestions that were made here today. And I think what's important is we have to move on it, get to the next steps, and certainly try and move forward in achieving some of the objectives that are set out in the report.
And just Dr. Cashman, taking on from that, would it be possible for University College Cork even to take one of the islands with a large dereliction rate where there hasn't been an uptake of the Creecoina scheme to see how big an issue title is or what the issues are? Because if we can crack this nut on our islands, we can also crack this nut in other rural communities as well. So, but it would be just interesting to just get a handle on how big this issue is, because I have to say, to be quite honest with you, no more than Deputy O'Cuive when he was Minister, the current Housing Minister is very, very amenable to adapting and changing to try and get the uptake up in relation to the scheme.
Yep, thanks, Greg. That would certainly be possible. I mean, we've collected information specifically for this survey on foot of Comhar and Comhal's request to do, but it would be very feasible to do a further study or to explore this further in terms of specific individual island experiences on that point. Yeah, that would be very feasible. I don't see any problem in operationalising that, so to speak. And just if I may, just in terms of the occupancy and then kind of people's experience, one of the values of this type of survey is a lot of statistics, but there's also a lot of opportunity for people to set out their experience. And just one of the quotes, and again, this will be hot off the presses shortly, but someone said, so an older adult living on one of the islands has said, if my children are not allowed to build on family land when and if they plan on moving back to the island, I would have to move away as well to where they're living. So it's a really existential crisis here in terms of, it's not just young people not moving, but by not having that opportunity to move, it's having a huge impact on older generations' ability to stay in the islands as well. That's just a kind of an insight there.
Yes, I agree with everything he says there, and we're hearing that a lot, that people will move away because other members of the family won't be there. Just on the Creeconia, that's a piece of work we could do very quickly and very easily in our own organisation, working with somebody like nOileán. We know the islands, we really could do that very quickly. And actually, thank you for suggesting it, because it's certainly something I will be bringing back to my own board and suggesting, because it would be very useful to a lot of organisations.
Briefly, Deputy O'Cuive, do you want to come in?
I'm very surprised to hear that a family member of an island, or in other words, somebody who grew up in an island, as long as they're coming back to live on the island, wouldn't be classified as having a housing need. And certainly, I mean, I'd be very critical of things in Galway at times. But as long as you could establish you were coming back permanently, you would be considered to have a housing need if you are from the island. The problem we have is that the islands are not self-sustaining without bringing in teachers, bringing in all sorts of people. That's the challenge we seem to be facing. But I'm very, very surprised that any local authority would not deem you to have a social and economic connection with an island if you were returning full-time from the place where you grew up, because that's normally defined in the rural planning guidelines as qualifying for rural housing. So I'm a little puzzled as to how that became a problem.
Dr. Cashman, do you want to just comment on that?
I'm just referring there to somebody who filled out an anonymous basis as to their concerns around planning in terms of if my children can't get planning on the island, I won't be able to stay. So it's kind of I suppose it's a qualitative experience being set out here rather than, you know, I'm not saying there's a huge list of these people, and it's anonymous anyway. But we will be publishing the reasons for planning refusal in the report as well. And as I mentioned earlier on, site being an SSE is one of the key points, but also alleged or purported lack of housing need is one of the points. So perhaps further research could be done to dig into that a bit more. But certainly the perception coming across from the survey from islanders is that planning is difficult to obtain, and it is having an impact. People are saying, people told they don't have a housing need or whatever, and that's having an impact on people's sense of security on the islands as well.
I mean, one of the issues that does arise is if somebody has a mainland property and they're moving permanently to the island, but they want to keep the mainland property as a base, because lots of islanders, I know islanders who have always lived in the island, but they have a mainland property, because you spend so many nights out, particularly on the ones that are further offshore, when you want to go for services or children going to college or so on. And that can be an issue. So I think we need to dig a little bit deeper into that. And then there is, as you say, the perception issue, which can be very, very debilitating. If the word gets out on the street, there's no point in trying. That in a sense could be debilitating.
Look, I think the research that we have received today and presented to us today, I think is really useful from the point of view of trying to develop policy, not just in terms of the island communities, and it is, you know, a deep delve into it, and we're looking forward to looking further into this research, but I think it also has implications in terms of addressing housing needs on the mainland as well. And I think what's clear from the hearing that we had this morning, that there's an opportunity there for an approved housing body to be established through the Ras na Gaeltachta, and I think this committee should engage with Costa Gaelga in relation to that to make a strong recommendation that its remit could be extended to become an approved housing body for all of our island communities, and that's something that we take up with our colleagues. I think if we could have some data in terms of the uptake of the Croí Cónaithe and the bottleneck in terms of title, how big an issue it is, it's an issue that we will be willing as a committee to take up with Minister Darragh O'Brien, who I know is quite amenable to trying to address any such bottlenecks. And I think the other thing that's clear from the evidence this morning is that maybe we as a committee should write to each of the relevant local authorities, maybe to ask them to engage to a far greater extent with the community representatives on each of the islands to see if we can overcome some of the planning challenges that are there. So can I thank you this morning for the evidence that you've given us, for the work that's been put in, for commissioning this piece of research, which, you know, is a very innovative step by a community organisation to commission a piece of research like this. So can I thank you again for your time today. We now move on to the final topic on our agenda, which is e-health and living longer on our islands. We're just going to pause for a moment just to allow the witnesses to switch their seats. And we will then take the witnesses on e-health. We'll suspend just for 3 minutes. Back in public session now, and we're dealing with the final topic on our agenda, e-health and living longer on islands. So we have with us at the meeting today Dr. Ian McCabe, Project Manager with the HIVE, the Health Innovation via Engineering Lab at University of Galway, and the Manager of the Home Health Project and Healthy Islands Project and the Virtual Hospital Project. We have nOileán Curtis, Dr. nOileán Curtis, the General Practitioner serving Clare Island and Inishbigil in County Mayo, and an e-health advocate and pioneer. And Dr. Jennifer Dorn, Research Physician at the HIVE Lab, actively developing procedures and processes for integrating telemedicine into island communities. I'm going to ask Dr. Dorn to begin the opening statement, and the other two contributors are going to come in then. So Dr. Dorn, over to you.
Comhar deputies and senators, thank you for having us here today to address how to improve the quality and duration of life for those living on Ireland's offshore islands. My name is Dr. Jennifer Doran. I'm a medical doctor, a research physician in e-health, and I also have a background in law, having worked for over 5 years in the European Commission and Parliament, focusing in particular on the area of regional development. Today, as the Comhar said, I'm joined by my colleagues Dr. Ian McCabe and Dr. nOileán Curtis. Dr. nOileán Curtis is going to speak to you about the day-to-day realities and challenges of life as an island GP, while Dr. McCabe and myself will speak to you about the pilot projects in e-health, which the HIVE Lab in the University of Galway is pioneering. The HIVE Lab, Mhór dúirt an Comhar riamh, stands for Health Innovation via Engineering. So we are a group of doctors, researchers, thinkers and engineers focused on finding innovative solutions to healthcare problems using technology and engineering. We do this in the hopes of keeping the Irish population, in particular rural populations, living longer and better, and reducing the need for admission into our hospitals and care homes. We focused our work on some of the most isolated parts of Ireland, working at the frontier of where isolation meets innovation. So where better to start then than the islands? Our work began a year ago on Clare Island in the Home Health Project, and will soon expand to Inishturk and Inishbofin under the umbrella of the Healthy Islands pilot. With your support, we hope to expand this and grow the suite of healthcare solutions and options on offer to Ireland's islands and rural populations. We're also working on a pioneering virtual ward project aimed at delaying admission to and facilitating early discharge from hospital so as to keep people in their homes for longer. Deputies and senators, the COVID-19 pandemic showed us what can happen when patients are unable to visit their doctors or hospitals for fear of infection. However, similar barriers to healthcare exist year-round for a large portion of the population who find attendance to their healthcare provider difficult due to distance, disability, lack of transport, responsibility for loved ones, land and livestock, or inclement weather. In all these situations, a telemedicine solution could provide options for alternative models of care. Nowhere is this more true than in the management of chronic conditions such as hypertension, heart failure, diabetes and other comorbidities, which together represent the biggest burden on the Irish Health Service. Here, telemonitoring and telemedicine have the potential to revolutionise a patient's experience of care, to save time and money for both patients and provider alike, and to alleviate some of the strain on our already heaving health service. Modern medicine has meant that people are living longer, and correspondingly, there has been a huge increase in chronic illness. This means that new approaches are needed to deliver healthcare efficiently and effectively. This is especially important for those living many miles from their local tertiary care centre, whether distanced by land or sea. Telemedicine allows the secure, remote exchange of medical data between patients and healthcare professionals. It is used to increase patients' access to care and provide effective healthcare and services at a distance. The overarching goals of our work are A, to explore the impact of remotely delivered healthcare on the well-being of isolated rural communities, in particular the islands. B, to evaluate its impact on patients' experience of, engagement in and management of their own health and chronic conditions, and C, to investigate barriers to the adoption of digital health, well-being and monitoring among adult populations in rural communities, in particular the islands. Clare Island, where we began our work over a year ago, is home to a community of 160 people who have carved out a living for themselves on a remote island 5 kilometres off the west coast of Ireland. Serviced by a single doctor sitting 2 seats down, who travels weekly to the island from the mainland. It is not least home to several newborn babies, but also an ageing population attempting to live with and manage a complex tapestry of chronic conditions and comorbidities. For many, a routine hospital appointment can mean days away from home, an arduous journey via boat, bus and car, together with a costly stay on the mainland until weather permits a return home. And that's before we mention slippy cement steps at both island and mainline piers, where you sometimes have to take your life in your hands to get on the boat. This is particularly challenging for those with physical disabilities or activity-limiting conditions. In our work, we are conducting feasibility studies into the ways which the use of remotely delivered healthcare and health promotion can improve the health of a rural community, and examining its impacts on people's lives on both an individual and community level, all with a view to expanding this pilot model to other islands across rural Ireland. As my colleague Dr. McCabe will explain, through our work on the Healthy Islands project and the Home Health project, together with our partners in the HSE, Cisco, the Western Development Commission, we hope to bridge the gap and level up access to healthcare for those in the rural and offshore areas of Ireland. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm Ian. I'm just going to paraphrase some of the stuff here because you don't need to hear me read it all out. I work in the HIVE lab. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm a scientist. I'm a physicist. And I've been working in the School of Medicine the past year with Professor O'Keefe, who is the PI on this project. He's the consultant endocrinologist in the hospital there and also a professor of medical device technology in the university. So he bridges that important gap between the HSE and research. So I'm a native islander as well. I'm from Clare Island, and I've been working for the university from Clare Island for the past 8 years. So I've field tested a lot of the technology that we're trying to put in place in the health project. So what we're doing is, in large part, it's driven by the adoption of broadband through our rural areas. So while we haven't seen the National Broadband Plan come out yet, the broadband technologies available have increased dramatically in the past 5-6 years. And we're able to use that for this type of research. So we're doing things like virtual consultations, remote monitoring of patients, community-based health activity and nutrition strategies for individuals. We're also doing some more kind of exotic things like using robots, which you saw, some of you might have seen on RT News a few months ago. Using drones to deliver medical supplies. We're trialing using artificial intelligence to help with the scheduling of patients. And we're also going to start a trial soon using remote telepresence to try and see if we can help combat some loneliness in the island population. The important things that we've put in place, which I think kind of set this project apart from other projects that I've worked with, is that we have a really strong consortium of organizations involved in the management. You know, not least of which is the so-called quadruple helix. So the industry, we're funded for the Home Health project and the virtual hospital project by Cisco and Science Foundation Ireland. We have very strong community engagement, which I'll talk more about in a moment. Government, so we include Mayo County Council and individuals from the DRCD in our monthly meetings, and academia. So there's a collaboration between University of Galway and UCD happening for the human nutrition side of things. But also internally, we're trying to be multidisciplinary. So not just looking at it from a doctor's point of view, we also have psychology involved, we have mathematics involved, we have education involved, we have nursing involved, we have epidemiology involved, education. So we're multidisciplinary, trying to get towards some sort of a transdisciplinary, where we would eventually down the line consider bringing in more representation from the arts and try and treat it as a whole of society issue. So the second thing, and probably the most important thing, and the point that I'd really like to stress, is that we've been very careful to make sure that the community has been listened to and engaged with very thoroughly from the start. And this initially began through the community organisation, so the Clear Development Company, and we conducted a number of roundtable discussions on the island with islanders able to, basically we gave them the opportunity to say yay or nay on the entire project at the beginning, and we continue to stress this communication and this constant integration with the island. We have a person employed whose sole purpose is to be that bridge between the research project and the community, and this has been very important, and this is why we've seen that there's been great uptake in the community. And that is the one thing that has been a very powerful tool for us as researchers, is that we have very strong community engagement. And we believe that the islands represent a great place to conduct this type of research, because we have communities which are already engaged. You've heard from other islands who have discussed their community organisations and the level of engagement that they have, and that continues through this. We have individuals who are keen for change and keen to adopt new technology as well. So what we would see is the islands as the natural place to conduct this type of research, with the goal of rolling it out beyond these individual projects which have limited duration, but into something more of a national strategy. Not least of the most important people who we have engaged with have been the doctors and the nurses on the islands, who have been very supportive. And I'm going to hand over to Dr. Curtis, who can tell you a bit more about what it's like to be a doctor serving an island. Thanks.
Thank you. So the people of the offshore islands of Ireland, healthcare professionals and patients alike, are no strangers to using all technology available at the time to access care. From lighting a bale of hay to signal the need for help from the mainland, to dropping medications by drone 100 years later, many advances have been made. My father, GP to the islands for over 40 years, recounts visits where he travelled on foot or bicycle to see patients, and I know there was one incident involving a GP seated in an armchair in a trailer being towed behind a tractor. Now there are engines instead of oars and cars instead of bikes. As technology has become more advanced, we have embraced it all on the islands. Using phones, faxes, emails, computers and smartphones, all have been integrated into use for healthcare. Technology is used to help care for patients every day of the week. This latest home health project is a wonderful new platform for improving access to healthcare, and we are eager to see it continue and expand beyond the timeline of this pilot project. In the short time since the project started, several new diagnoses have been made that most likely would have been delayed without the project, and the management of known conditions has improved. Patients are being given the knowledge and tools to become more mindful of their health, and in many cases to start to self-manage their chronic conditions. They are being empowered to improve their health, and this will lead to their ability to stay healthier for longer and therefore remain independently on the island for longer. Work continues, making more consultations with secondary care and the allied health professionals available electronically as well, so that unnecessary travel can be eliminated. This patient-centred model should be rolled out to non-island as well as island communities. Improved connectivity will benefit all walks of life on the island and encourage more people to stay. A detailed review of all of Ireland's inhabited islands was carried out between 2014 and 2016 by the HSE and published in 2017. Among the many recommendations, the report states that the HSE will work to develop telemedicine services for islands with a view to facilitating the delivery of video link consultations, providing services that promote mobile assessment and enhance service delivery on islands in line with best practice, improving multidisciplinary working and providing online training and education. However, all the technology is reliant on the healthcare professionals, especially the GPs, to function. Government's own National Islands Policy 2023 to 2033 refers to the HSE Primary Care Island Services Review and supports the need to
provide the right care in the right place at the right time. GPs form the foundation of the healthcare service in Ireland. To make a simplistic comparison, if healthcare is compared to a house, GPs are the foundation. Of course we need walls and a roof. This can be compared to our secondary and tertiary care in hospitals. The allied health services are also needed to fit and furnish the home. However, you cannot build an extension without having more foundations, and no matter how many extra rooms are created or how many fancy fixtures and fittings you install, if you do not have a solid, adequate foundation, the cracks will appear and the house will eventually collapse. In the recent ICGP publication, Shaping the Future, it was noted that Ireland has one of the highest rural populations in Europe, at 31%. However, only 15% of Irish GPs cater for this highly dispersed and often elderly population with many complex health needs. Therein lies a significant inequity of access to healthcare for our rural and island populations. Over 29 million consultations take place in general practice each year, and each patient on average visits their GP 4.3 times per year. Almost a quarter of these GPs are aged over 60. I commenced work as a GP in Mayo in September 2001. Over the past 22 years, the population of the county has increased by approximately 20,000. The age profile has gone up. As per the CSO, Mayo has one of the highest average age profiles and one of the highest old age dependency rates in the country. People are living longer and have more complex care needs. The variety of treatment options available has risen. The workload for all healthcare professionals has gone up. With an ever-increasing number of medical cards, the development and expansion of the chronic disease management programme and the significant work that the COVID vaccination programme has brought, to mention a few, the workload for GPs continues to rise all the time. This is hugely important work in terms of the benefit for individuals, families and their communities, but there are less and less GPs available to do this. In September 2001, there were 78 GMS GP posts in County Mayo. At the same time, there were 21 consultant posts in the county hospital, now Mayo University Hospital. In the interim period of 22 years, the number of consultant posts has almost tripled to 57, and the number of GMS GP posts has not changed and remains at 78. There are many other GPs working in the county. There are part-time and sessional GPs, but the overall number has not increased significantly, and the GMS posts that have stayed the same, with some of these not even being filled. There are 5 GMS posts in the county that remain empty today. 4 of these are rural. The fact that the GMS contract still contains a 24/7, 365 commitment to patients is certainly a huge factor in younger GPs voting with their feet and not taking up GMS posts. Another recommendation in the Island Services report states that GPs need to be provided with adequate locum supports to enable them to take leave and to attend ongoing training on a consistent basis. Unless the conditions improve dramatically for GPs, in particular remote and rural GPs, this country will continue to lose our highly trained and talented GPs to countries with better working conditions. Without a GP to look after the healthcare needs of an island community, the population will slowly decline. The No Doctor, No Village campaign of 2016 is even more true for a community on an offshore island. So, what is required to turn this around? The 19th World Rural Health Conference, hosted in rural Ireland and the University of Limerick last year, with over 650 participants coming from 40 countries and an additional 1,600 engaging online, carefully considered this question and in response published the Limerick Declaration on Rural Healthcare, which asserts the right of rural and island communities to equitable access to healthcare and is a blueprint to transform healthcare for rural and island communities on this island. This statement is also in support of World Health Assembly Resolution 72.2 on primary healthcare, which calls on all stakeholders to provide support to Member States in mobilising human, technological, financial and information resources to help build strong and sustainable primary healthcare, as envisaged in the Declaration of Astana. The Limerick Declaration on Rural Healthcare calls for the following key actions for rural and island communities. The current focus on large urban-based healthcare infrastructure development should be widened to include investment in rural healthcare infrastructure so as to ensure decent working conditions for rural healthcare workers. This will include funding to uncover investment in innovative technological solutions to enhance, but not replace, face-to-face service. Socially accountable higher educational institutions need to develop rural academic, educational and research infrastructure closely aligned to the communities which they serve. Building on established international examples, we recommend that specific undergraduate medical, nursing and allied health professionals programmes are developed which are dedicated to producing graduates who have the skills, attitudes and desire to work in rural and remote locations. We need targeted admission policies to enrol students with a rural background in health worker education programmes. Specific rural curricula and pathways should exist within undergraduate and postgraduate training, where exposure to rural practice should be maximised based on the if they can't see it, they can't be it principle. We need to deploy a package of fiscally sustainable financial and non-financial incentives for health workers practising in rural and remote areas. Here in Ireland, for general practice, we have the rural support framework, but the criteria for access is narrow and the quantum is relatively very small, so both need to be increased immediately and not in 2024 when it's up for review. Challenges of smaller rural healthcare practices should be recognised and supported through innovative solutions involving cooperatives to develop equitable out-of-hours commitments, shared appointments, salaried posts, fellowship positions and creating partnerships and clusters of practice. We need guaranteed holiday maternity and paternal leave, and this should be a minimum requirement for a rural healthcare practice. Development of a clear rural general practice career pathway or pipeline. A target regarding the proportion of Irish medical graduates required in general practice to deliver sláinte care should be set. The equivalent figure in the UK is 50%. To provide clinical, academic and advocacy leadership for the above, chairs of rural general practice should be funded within higher education institutions with, in addition, a national clinical lead for rural healthcare within the ICGP and a national lead for rural healthcare delivery within the HSE. We must enable dynamic co-production of data on rural health between communities, health workers, academic researchers, policymakers and civil society organisations by mainstreaming rural research activities. The lived experiences and voices of the community need to be reflected in the research used to generate this evidence, and ring-fenced and proportional research funding accessible to communities and rural researchers building an equitable community of research practice is required to deliver this. The recent motion from the Rural and Island Dispensing Doctors of Ireland group at the IMO AGM of a 2-for-1 model of practice needs serious consideration. Equitable access to healthcare is a crucial marker of democracy. Hence, I call not only on the Irish government, but on all governments, policymakers, academic institutions and communities globally to commit to providing their rural and island dwellers with equitable access to healthcare, which is properly resourced and fundamentally patient-centred in its design. Otherwise, it is very clear that rural and island communities will again be left behind. All the technology in the world will amount to little if there are no GPs to run the services.
Thanks very much. The first person is the last Deputy O'Cahissy.
Comhar, if possible, I want to put a specific question first and then I have a range of other queries then. Dr. Kirsten, the first question is, why is it always that my children run a temperature at 3 o'clock in the morning and not at any more convenient time? But I just wanted, just for the, I suppose, the sake of people listening in who don't have a context or an experience. So my experience with that, if my child wakes up running a high temperature at 3 o'clock in the morning, we'll jump out of bed, we make the run into the care doc. More often than not, then you leave the care doc with a script for an antibiotic and strong advice to get a bottle of Calpol on the way home. Other times, and it's happened a couple of times, the care doc takes a look at the unfit and says, to UHW with you, it took me 15 minutes to get into the care doc, it's going to take me 10 minutes to ferry him out to ED out in UHW. The call will have been put in ahead of time. Can you outline to us how different that experience would be if I woke up with my child at 3 o'clock in the morning running a high temperature on Clare Island?
What will happen in Clare Island? You'll get through to the nurse and she'll ring me. She'll assess the patient and she'll ring me. At the moment, due to the unavailability of out-of-hours cover, I'm actually pretty much on duty 24/7. I had to get a locum to come here today. So that's the difference in a lot of rural communities where you have a small single-handed practice, you don't have enough out-of-hours cover, so you're on duty a lot. There's nothing wrong with out-of-hours cover. It should be available. Nobody can be available 24/7. It's not possible. You can't keep doing it long term. It's not sustainable. But in a small rural community, it's often what happens. And on the west coast of Ireland, there are a lot of those practices who are on duty a lot of the time. Some GPs are in a rota system, so they take cover for other practices. Ideally, of course, it's lovely to talk to your own GP because they'll know you better, you know, but it's not always possible. So out-of-hours cover has to come into play, but it needs to be improved in a lot of the rural communities. It was brought in initially to try and improve the lot of rural GPs or single-handed practices in a rota system, but in fact it's the more urban practices and centres that have benefited most because they have more people involved in them, so they don't have to take on as much of the workload. But in Clare Island, you'll get me on the phone and I'll hopefully advise you.
And no advice on why they seem to always do it in the middle of the night. But anyway, if we figure that out. I just wanted to ask a few more general questions. First is to talk about the demographic situation. Firstly, I want to say, look, we talked about the idea of lighthouse communities in terms of sustainable energy. I absolutely think there's a case to be made to have lighthouse communities in terms of e-health. It makes absolute sense to me to roll that out on the island first. I wanted a better understanding, I suppose, of the demographics on the islands. I'm going to make an assumption that it's an older and ageing population, but I may well be wrong on that. And I wanted, if you could, and this would be a very general answer, but if you could kind of characterise the general health of the islanders, this would also, I think, play into those kind of demographic pressures and that maybe the instance of chronic conditions that you referenced. And I also just wanted to ask a question about the availability of mental health supports. I know that rural isolation is a real and pressing issue across rural Ireland. My sense here is that community is stronger on the islands, but again, that's me coming in and making a generalisation without having a good knowledge of how things are on the ground and whether loneliness and that rural isolation is an issue on the islands.
That's a great question, thank you. So first of all, just talking on Clare Island, there's 160 people, but it is an ageing population. I mentioned newborn babies, but we have people in their 90s living there. And as you rightly said, you know, there's a lot of people who manage multiple chronic conditions. We discussed earlier on, just when Dr. Cashman was talking about older people who can't get planning permission, whose kids can't get planning permission, so they say, well, I'll have to leave. You know, there are a lot of older people living alone whose families live on the mainland. So while the community does gather around, that can be a real issue, for example, in terms of older people going into care homes prematurely, or older people having to stay in an acute bed in a hospital because there's nobody at home to look after them. They should be well enough to go home, but there's no services on the, you know, physio can't get out to them, or it's much more difficult. And there's no home helps. On Clare Island, we have one home help who's part-time. And then this kind of ties in a little bit to what Senator Garvey was saying about, she was saying she was going to speak to Simon Harris about, you know, islands becoming self-sustaining and self-sustainable and training up people on the islands. The problem is, you know, if you want to become a home help or a healthcare assistant, but you live on the island, you're not going to be able to go to a FETAC level 5 course, you know, in Westport, which is, you know, it requires, you know, 6 months to do it. So how do you train up people that live on the islands already to ensure that older people can remain on the islands? Because it's an absolutely heartbreaking situation to see someone who was born on the island, who has lived on the island all their lives, but doesn't have someone to look after them in their own home, having to leave for the last years of their life. Like, it's no good for the community and really, really awful for the older person themselves. So yeah, it is an ageing population. There is a great sense of community. People do look in on at each other, but there are certain things that need doing, that you need training for, and also that you need payment for. You know, if you're trained and if you're looking in on a neighbour, obviously everybody looks out for each other, but if it's a case of someone has been allocated X number of home help hours a day by the HSE, that's no good if there's no home helps there. And you can't send someone out from the mainland because that'll take a whole day for someone's, you know. So that's one thing. And you were asking about mental health as well. And I think it's my background's actually in psychiatry, and there's a serious problem with mental health services across the country and shortages. And mental health is something that it lends itself so well to being provided at a distance, but it is, you know, the islands, just like everywhere else, there's long waiting lists, in particular for, you know, adolescent mental health services. So, you know, and people deteriorate in the time that they're waiting. So it is, I mean, across the board, there is just not enough in terms of mental health services being provided to the islands. And there are additional challenges like loneliness and isolation. And, you know, if for a young person, if you're being bullied in school, there's no escape. You don't go home. You're living and growing up with these people all the time, you know. So it is, you know, there's a huge need there as well. I think, Ian, you're an Islander. I don't know if you have anything to add.
Dr. McCabe.
Yeah, so with respect to the demographics, yes, it is an aging population, and it compares to the current population demographic of Japan in terms of the age profile, which is where Europe is going to be in the next 15 to 20 years. So the islands in general are very much a precursor for the national problems that are coming down the line. So with respect to lighthouse communities, I think they're an exceptional model. You also have the capacity to engage not just the most engageable portion of that community, which is, you know, sometimes you put out a survey and it might be online and you're only getting the people who are online. You have an opportunity to engage a large percentage of the community, from the younger to the older. So for those purposes, we, I think, are going to concentrate on islands. In the university, we're going to concentrate on islands for the rollout of this type of technology that we're doing. And I think that they make an exceptional platform because of that. With respect to the mental health support, like Jennifer said, there's not really anything currently in place except ad hoc or on the mainland. But it's definitely something that we would like to facilitate. So we're not part of the HSE, we're part of the university academic network, but we have the technology, we have the means, we have the know-how to facilitate it, and we're doing it. You know, we're facilitating remote consultations with people who we're doing it right. You know, we've done a handful, but it's beginning. The biggest barrier, of course, is all the red tape. You know, we have spent most of the last 3 months on data protection forms and applications, and it really kind of has hampered. But as we're getting these things past us, we're able to probably focus more and more on delivery of that type of thing.
Thank you. Dr. Curtis, do you want to add anything? Dr. Curtis, do you want to add anything?
Just again about the mental health issues, my experience would also be from a patient-to-patient basis that the very ones with mental health issues are very often the least able to get their heads around planning enough to get on a boat, go across the mainland, drive to an appointment which may be very emotional or traumatic, and then come back. So very often those appointments are missed when they're on the mainland. So again, telehealth is an ideal platform for them to access that.
Thank you. Deputy O'Huive.
Sorry. There's an awful lot in this subject. We could be at it for a long time. But there's one thing you mentioned as part of what you said that I think can be underestimated. And that is that, as well as the pure health issues, access is key. In other words, the frequency of the ferry services or the plane services that they have in Aran, their speed, their quality, the piers, the difference between getting on from a pontoon where the tide doesn't make any difference, and if you're in a wheelchair, you get in at one level and you get off at the same level, and so on. That we must continue to invest in those things, because not only do they have an impact on day-to-day living, but they have a huge impact on the more vulnerable in society. And I think that I take from you what you said, that this is still a challenging issue. The second thing is, two groups, and you mentioned the second group, in other words, the elderly are an issue. But we want young people on the islands, but young people often have chronic issues, and the other problem with a young person is the syndrome when we had, whom our third was young, an occasion that, lucky for us, we got the doctor quickly. Now, She was never sick much before or after, but she had a roaring temperature. And he used to talk about it again and again after it happened. So access is hugely important, to know what to do and the correct thing to do. And I think that's important. And that leads to the issue. When my kids were young, there was a local doc. I live in a very rural area, but much different from an island, but it's not on an island. But the local doctor is available 24/7. That world does not exist anymore or won't exist into the future. And I think there's a big job for this committee to do, not only on the island context, because we can't get rural GPs either, we can't get island GPs. The job in Mhór is vacant for some time. There's been difficulty getting doctors in this year. We need to look at the packages you put forward and see what we can do to ensure that not only doctors, but nurses, physios, and all the rest of the therapies are available. And I think we should, through the chair, look at this and do a quick bit of work on that issue, because people will not settle. The people who are there are going to stay, but the people will not move into places where they don't think that their children will get good health services. And that issue. Two questions. You talk about remote monitoring. Have you specific examples of remote monitoring, for diabetes or for hypertension or whatever, or what does it entail? And I'd always make the comment that, contrary to what's often given to the impression in the media, my experience of people, generally urban and rural, is they adopt the technology when it suits them. And they adopt very fast. And I can remember the people when the mobile phones came in within 5 or 10 years. You used to have the number stuck with a bit of sellotape in the back of it, but they had the phone and they knew how to do whatever they wanted to do. Then Skype came in, and they were all Skype in Australia for the sons and daughters. And when COVID came in, they were sitting in the mart and they were looking at the cattle being sold, and they were well able to say when to sell and when not to sell. So people adapt. I actually think that's the easiest part of the challenge. It's getting all the technology and getting acceptance of the system and getting over all these GDP problems committed. The final question I have is, particularly now, and there's always a downside to everything, bike hire has become a major, major, major issue on islands, in Mhór, in Seir, in Ispaff, and Clare Island, I understand. Bike hire is a major issue because people who never ride bikes suddenly take out a bike from a hire and they fall off the bike. And that's putting big pressure on the GPs. But it also raises the whole issue of evacuation of people suffering from trauma, which can be by boat or by helicopter. And a safe way to get them, wherever they fall, to the helicopter or the boat that is covered for the medic who has to do the job and that is proper and gives you the equipment, particularly on the smaller islands. On the bigger islands, we can put in an ambulance, but on the smaller islands, and how you train people and so on. That is becoming, in my experience, an issue raised with me time and again, particularly on the islands in my constituency.
Thank you. Maybe Dr. McCabe, you might come in first on some of those issues, and I'll bring in the other two witnesses then.
Yep. So access is key. That remains true, absolutely. So one of the key things is that e-health, telemedicine should be supplementary to the existing person-to-person healthcare. At no point do we ever want to try and replace physical contact with humans, which is vitally important for the healthcare outcomes. And to that end, yeah, I think we need harbour infrastructure that's capable of facilitating this older demographic of people, and we need ferry services that are adaptable or frequent enough so that our healthcare professionals, not just our GPs and nurses, but our physiotherapists, our speech and language therapists, our occupational therapists, who we have been engaging, and we're seeking to offer a telemedicine solution, but they still need to come and see their patients. They're telling us that they have great difficulties seeing patients on islands because of the logistics of it. So they say they either need a dedicated team just for the islands, or they need better ferry and infrastructure to let them come and go, because they can see one island patient in the same period of time it would take them to see 5 mainland patients. So it's just not feasible for them. The packages for the healthcare professionals, I think that's better answered by Noreen. Our remote monitoring, we're currently conducting a study of hypertension, so that's high blood pressure. Our participants, who are also hypertension patients, are issued with a blood pressure monitor that they put on their arm at home, press the button. We have a software on the phone that will take the blood pressure reading and it will present that to the cloud. So we have all the technical aspects of that. We have the GDPR side of that 90% of the way through, and once the GDPR is cleared, we will be able to take that data and use it for not just the remote monitoring, but that will enable the virtual consultations as well. So it's a steep learning curve with GDPR, but we're getting there. We also have capacity for remote monitoring of blood glucose through the continuous glucose monitors, and we plan with the virtual hospital project to look at COPD and heart failure. So I think Jenny would be better to speak about those.
Dr. Jordan, do you want to come in? Briefly, yeah.
Are there any issues with bandwidth and resilience in using this remote technology, and is there anything we need to do to ensure you've got the bandwidth and the resilience to make this long-term sustainable and fail-safe?
Dr. McCabe.
Well, the short answer is yes. There's issues, major issues. Of course there are. Right now we're relying on the patient's home broadband, which in a lot of cases is the 2 megabyte per second download speed and 1 up. Which is completely insufficient. We're quite hopeful that the NBP will roll out to the islands fairly soon and allow us to have home-based patient care, and that's part of the reason why for the Healthy Islands project we're trying to focus the care and the telehealth solutions in the health clinics on the islands. But again, we're seeing big differences in not just the space that's available in those health clinics, but the connection that's there. And so we have some issues to address with the connection. We're looking at bespoke connections for some health clinics to enable us to do that. And also we're struggling with a little bit with the space, because some of this is quite bulky, big screens and monitors and things that roll out. So we need a good bit of space. So it's a big ask. Noreen is brilliant. She's very accommodating, and we're working through all these solutions, but it just takes time.
Dr. Jordan.
Just to give you a little bit more about what you were asking about the remote monitoring. So yeah, so far our main focuses have been diabetes and hypertension. We did what's called a morbidity map. So we looked through Dr. Curtis's records and mapped out all of the chronic conditions on Clare Island, and then we also did another map of the internet connection, and that limited the number of people we could include in our pilot study, because as Ian was saying, when we did our original pilot, if you don't have good enough internet connection, then you can't take part, but we're working on that. But it's been very successful, and we've actually picked up several new diagnoses of hypertension that we wouldn't have picked up potentially for several years. And I don't know how much you know about high blood pressure, but it causes, it's insidious and causes really increases your chance of heart attack and stroke, and the sooner you pick it up and treat it, the better. So we have these people with their devices, and so then what we did in our trial was we brought them down we have a health hub with a big Cisco screen, and the patient could come in, and myself and Dr. Derek O'Keefe, who's a specialist in hypertension, would be remotely speaking to the patient, and we'll be able to use the screen to literally show them all the data we collected, explain to them, you know, in this red section is where you're out of range, so you're out of, you know, your blood pressure is high 30% of the time. This is why we need to make this change, and then bring them back a month later. This is people in their 80s who might like have to spend 2 nights off the island just for a 10-minute appointment, and we're able to monitor them remotely. Same with the diabetes. So it's been really successful and given us, we've got a lot of positive feedback from our patients about their experiences. So,
Dr. Curtis.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to address the issues that you raised about the transport of patients on the island. And we're blessed that we have 2 amazing nurses on the island. They're fantastic, and they're my eyes and ears when I'm not there. They're absolutely super. If one of the nurses says, I think you better come out, I may as well start running out the door because it's something urgent. They're absolutely fabulous, couldn't say enough about them. We're very lucky as well to have fantastic evacuation services off the island in terms of the lifeboat and the helicopter. They're always available, they're absolutely super responsive, but that takes a bit of time. And in the meantime, if you have somebody who's injured on the island, you need to get them to a safe place. A lot of the injuries will happen outdoors. E-bikes that you mentioned, bane of our lives in the summertime. We have more and more people on them and without helmets sometimes, and we get a lot of injuries, fractured hips, fractured skulls, lots of injuries. But at the moment we do not have any adequate transportation to get those patients from where they're injured to the helipad or to the health centre where they can be cared for until the services arrive to take them off the island. And that is a big problem at the moment. I've been banging on about this for the last 10 years, but at the moment the vehicle out there is just a small 2-seater van that the nurse uses on her daily visits, and there's no space to put a patient in the back of it. So when there is an injury, and we've done this over and over and over again, we go out, we get the patient all packaged up, ready to go, and then it's, okay, who's got the nearest, highest van? Hike out all your tools, let's get the patient in, often in the dark, in the back of the van with the phone light on, so you can see them and monitor them, and then down to the helipad or to the clinic. And it's really undignified, and we can do better. We can do better in this day and age. On the other small island I look after in Ishpigel, one of the patients actually went and bought a big van so that it could be used for this purpose. Because again, we had several incidents where we were trying to get somebody into the back of a Jeep was the biggest vehicle available, and a very ill patient, and you're hanging onto the back of the seat and you're hanging onto the stretcher so he doesn't slip out the back because the boot doesn't close. We can do better in this day and age. We really can, and we should, and our patients deserve better. And the vehicle on Clare Island needs to be changed. And it's not an ambulance we need. That's too big and too high, and it wouldn't be used often enough to remain roadworthy. But we need a vehicle, something like a Jeep style thing where we can put a stretcher into the back to care for a patient, to get them out of the elements, get them to where they need to go, and put services in as well. So very often the lifeboat crew, when they come out to help with an incident, they're fantastic for doing all the lifting, the heavy lifting, or manning the helipad, and to be able to bring them from the harbour when they get there to the incident is important. Or again, the fire service, the Gardaí, whoever is needed in an incident, to get those people transported to where they need to be, and more importantly, to get the patient transported back to the helipad or to the health centre. It's hugely important, has been for years, and I'd love to see that happen before I retire.
Ms. Nishartik, you wanted to come in there.
Yes, I suppose I find the whole conversation around the telehealth and the e-health services on islands is fascinating, and I think it has a really, really strong place in island communities, and it's going to be very, very helpful going forward. I think one of the things, though, that is important is that it doesn't replace access to healthcare. It does mean that still patients will obviously have to still travel for their appointments. I think the main thing really that needs to be looked at, and again it ties in with what the doctor in Clare Island was just talking about, in terms of services, being undignified for people. We really, really need to address disability access on piers for our local residents. We have situations where patients are having to be carried in their wheelchairs up gangways. Depending on the tides, they might have to be carried up onto the top deck from the pier and then carried downstairs to get them inside. It isn't unsafe, and it's no criticism of the crew on the ferries or on the planes. They're fantastic, they're so helpful, they're so kind. But really in 2023, I think those people deserve better. It's really undignified. It's embarrassing for them. It's stressful for them. You know, I think that's something that in this day and age, really, we shouldn't be dealing with, and they shouldn't be dealing with. And often these are really vulnerable people, and who probably don't have a voice and probably aren't being heard. And so I think that that's something as a matter of urgency that should be addressed on all islands, because I'm sure it's the same all across the board. And the other thing I suppose that presents a huge issue as well sometimes is people with acute health conditions that require specific medications. Often those medications have to be refrigerated. Trying to get them to islands can be a real challenge. I know of patients on the island who are having difficulty accessing their medication because the company that delivers the medication has no experience with delivering it to an offshore island. It needs to be kept refrigerated at all times. They are looking into the options available, but like, you know, they're talking about things like drones and things that might be possible to use. But in the meantime, it's really urgent that this person gets their medication, and it's not happening at the moment. And that's something that should be sped up. It shouldn't be something that's put down to talk about at a meeting in a few weeks' time, and we'll see and we'll try and find something, because at the moment this person then is going without the medication that they really need. And you know, I think those two things would would really be transformative in terms of health on the islands and in terms of allowing people to live longer on the islands. It's about giving people dignity at the end of the day. And you know, I think in 2023 we probably should be able to afford that to everybody. You know, and that's we're lucky in Inishmore. We have some new piers. We have, you know, we have a pontoon in Resaville, but and I know a lot of the islands have much worse conditions. I know the pier on Inisheer is dangerous for all passengers in the winter months. But when you're talking about a wheelchair user being carried by crew on board the boat and things like that, it's dangerous, frankly. But it isn't good enough.
Thank you, Senator Burke.
Thank you. The presentation that was made to us in Clare Island, to the Oireachtas members in Clare Island, was very impressive. And the best place to get sick in Ireland is in Clare Island because they have availability of drones, robots, and helicopters. I have just two questions for Dr. Curtis. One is, you say there that the development of a clear rural general practice career pathway or a pipeline, a target regarding the proportion of Irish medical graduates to deliver sláinte care. The equivalent figure you say in the UK is 50%. Are you saying that's 50% of all the graduates that come out every year that they should be retained within the health services? Is that what you're saying?
Ideally, yes. Ideally, I'd like... Sorry.
Yeah, the second question is, chairs of rural general practice. I thought most general practices are nearly all sole traders, but when you said the chairs of the general practice, what do you mean by chairs of general practice, where they should be funded within the higher education institutions?
Thanks, Dr. Curtis.
Thanks. With regard to the percentage of GPs being kept in the system, I'd like to keep 100% of our trainees in the system. I'd like to see all Irish trainees. They're absolutely fabulous, and I'd like to see them all staying in the country, but the current conditions isn't conducive to that. With regard to a pathway, I feel that when GP trainees leave their training system, very often they're sort of cast adrift a little bit. They've been managed through their GP training in a very structured fashion, and all of a sudden they're out into the working world, and there isn't a very definitive pathway for them to follow unless they choose to go into a GMS post, which very few of them do, or go abroad, or take a sessional post, which is what most of them end up doing. In the University of Limerick, they spent a lot of time in general practice, and they would have a higher rate of people ending up in rural general practice because they spent 18 weeks. I've recently started teaching at the University of Limerick, and I'm looking after students in Northwest Hub who are all in remote rural practices as far as possible. It's a new development in the Northwest from UL, and these students are getting an 18-week placement in rural practice. It's actually their longest clinical placement, and because of that, they're more likely statistically going forward to end up in rural practice. So I think the other universities maybe need to look at having their students spend more time in general practice than the usual 2 weeks, which is what most of them spend. So I think that could be incorporated into the pathway, and then when they come out the other end of qualified and then eventually GP training, I think some way of gathering those newly qualified GPs into a structured workforce needs to be looked at. I think, in fact, two birds could be killed with one stone here, because GPs in situ have huge problems getting locums. And I think if these newly qualified GPs were offered maybe salaried positions in a structured fashion where they could maybe do a certain number of weeks for GP A, GP B, C, D in an area, that very often they will find a practice where they go, I like that, I love that, I could work there, I could live there, I could raise my family there. Whereas now they're being asked either to commit fully, 100%, 24/7 to a job, or, well, do what you want, or part-time, or leave the country. But I think if they were harnessed into a more structured work format after they qualify as GPs, we might see a lot more of them choosing to stay. That's my belief in that anyway. I think we're losing far too many of our fabulous GPs to foreign countries. With regard to the chairs of general practice, there is a chair of rural general practice has just been established actually in UL. Professor Peter Hayes is the new chair of rural general practice down there, but the other universities, they have a chair of general practice, but it's not specific to rural. So there's a very big difference between rural general practice and urban general practice. Yes, we're all GPs, but only people working in rural areas will really know what it means to be a rural GP. And I think chairs established in all universities for rural general practice would be an important step forward.
Thank you. Deputy Donnelly.
Thanks very much, and thanks very much for the presentation. It's absolutely fascinating to see technology being used in this way. Just a really specific question on mental health. Are there any specific e-health programs, projects in relation to mental health to support people on the islands or in rural communities? And also, would there be any specific, particularly for children maybe with additional needs, who, as we know, whether you're urban or whether you're rural, the support services there are just really bad and very difficult to access. I can only imagine what it must be like on an island if you have a child with additional needs. And just to refer then onto the disability access, you know, in Dublin 15 at the moment, we've Blanchetown Community, the Centre for Independent Living, are currently doing a week of Make Way. So anybody who is parking on a footpath, or, you know, there could be a signage in the way, or a cafe would have a board outside. They're just making people aware of you know, the issues facing people with disabilities and access and being able to move around. Again, my limited experience on islands, I just cannot imagine how people managed on islands with disabilities, and I just echo that the supports absolutely need to be put in place.
You want to answer maybe that first?
Yeah, just with regards to there being specific or additional supports for mental health supports for people on islands, to my knowledge, there is nothing. Nothing additional. You go in and just like everybody else, you wait your turn. And it's interesting you mentioned children with additional needs, because that is one area that we've already started trying to facilitate virtual consultations, because, you know, say you have a child who's got sensory issues and things, you know, getting them into the doctors is difficult enough, never mind involving schlepping them out on a boat and driving them somewhere, getting them. So we have been trying to make our office space more friendly towards, you know, to children, and to facilitate parents and kids in, you know, to have those consultations remotely where possible. And that is, it does lend itself well. But again, the wait times in between appointments are so long, and you find children, you know, disimproving, regressing. So then it's a case that, you know, people with children with additional needs should be able to move to the islands if they want to. But if you're facing, you know, your child maybe not having the same access, or it being too difficult, then they won't. And ditto, I mean, not to the best of my knowledge, there's nobody in a wheelchair currently living on Clare Island, but there is definitely older people who find walking difficult, and it is, you know, the terrain's hard. You end up, I think, a lot of the time being very housebound, which is lonely, but Ian might know more than I on that. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Dr. McCabe?
I think if you look around on islands, you probably won't see too many people in wheelchairs in general, and that's not because people in wheelchairs don't exist, it's because they can't live on islands. We recently had the pleasure of going to Inishturk, the neighbouring island to Clare Island, and the steps to come from the pier, they're about that high. Even as an able-bodied person, I found them quite challenging. And I know anecdotal from members of my own family who are elderly, when they're not feeling well, they stay put. So what it translates to is that the older people are forced, as their disability increases, to leave the island and seek care on the mainland. That's a given. Also, they'd be more inclined to stay away for longer periods, especially when the weather is unsettled, because as some of you know, Ruin up here is exceptionally exposed, and so on a standard travel day, the boat might be moored with 2-3 meters of swell. So you might have the boat traveling up and down, a couple of meters at a go every time a swell comes through, and people just can't manage that. So couple all of the access issues together, and it makes a very difficult situation for older people, for people who, people with heart issues who may not have the best balance, people with COPD who may find themselves caught short of breath. All these people would have great difficulty in travelling to and from the island, so they don't. That's the bottom line.
Thanks, Dr. Curtis.
Thanks very much. I'd just like to add to that as well, that apart from the difficulty of getting on and off the island in a wheelchair, getting in and out of the health centre in Clare Island is impossible in a wheelchair. The access is simply not there. In fact, we've had able-bodied people trip and fall coming in the door. It goes on to the infrastructure on the island as well, and we have to provide safe workspaces for people to work in, but safe spaces for the patients as well. And it's an old health centre. It's there for 50 years. It's great to have it, and it did the job back in the day, but nowadays the access is simply not as good as it should be or could be. And it wouldn't take a huge amount of work to sort it out and redesign it. And the other issue is that with the nurses at the moment, we have 2 nurses luckily who live on the island. They're from the island and live there, and but they won't be there forever. And when they do retire, there isn't anyone else looking likely at the moment to take up a resident position on the island, so the health centre has to double as a residence, and at the moment it's simply not fit for somebody to live in, to stay in. So it needs renovation. It's had a little bit, but it needs a bit more, and safer access for patients in wheelchairs.
Thanks. Deputy O'Queen.
Yeah. Just on that issue, there was an arrangement whereby 50% of the infrastructure costs on islands for health were provided by the Department of the Islands. Now, the experience of that was that it accelerated. In other words, they got pulled out. They weren't caught in this cost benefit. I'm doing it in a housing estate for 1,000 people versus an island with 100 people or 200 people or 300 people. And it accelerated them, and the HSE got fairly enthusiastic about doing the work. And in those cases, well, in one case, there was an incorporation of an apartment for locum, so there was a doctor locum or a nurse locum. It doesn't make any difference, but that there would be always an apartment available for somebody who had to stay on the island. Do you think that if we reverted to that, that it would incentivise the HSE to actually prioritise these fairly modest, they're very, very modest at what you need on an island because the population isn't huge, but that it would accelerate their ambition to go and do these things and to do them now rather than again, and it would take them out of the queue that's there on the cost-benefit analysis.
Dr. Curtis.
Absolutely, yes, of course it would. Yeah, if you want somebody to go and work on an island, it's already difficult to get housing, as we've heard. And if you want someone to go and live there and work there and care for the patients in healthcare, they have to be accommodated if they don't already live on the island. Like I said, we're lucky at the minute we have 2 who live there and have raised their families there, but we won't always have that. So we have to have somewhere that's nice for them to live in, and basic but nice, and safe for them to work in. So of course it would help, yeah. I'd love to see it happen.
Dr. McCabe.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that. So those are the needs of 20 years ago. If there's going to be development, it should also address the needs of the next 20 or 30 years. So the health centres on the islands need dedicated space for the technology that we're pioneering. They also need the connection to the national broadband infrastructure to enable the type of telemedicine that we're trying to make work to happen in those locations. So that's a very important part of.
Brief question.
Very quick. Are you privy to what NBI has proposed for the island, which is fibre from the box on the island to the houses, where it's telephone, as far as I know, it's a radio signal to the mainland, as opposed to fibre end to end? And my question is, will that be sufficient for what you need, and will it be resilient enough for what you need? Or should we put the cable in under the ground like we did with electricity and make it fibre end to end?
Dr. McCabe.
My personal position is that fibre end to end will be the better solution. We can only tell you what the needs of right now are, but as the Internet of Things and sensorized technology increases, the amount of bandwidth needed is going to be dramatically increasing. We're currently working with the OGCIO, the Government Chief Information Office, to trial a private 5G network on Clare Island that we hope to use for the health project. So we're hoping that will be in place in the near future to allow us to continue the rollout of our health initiative. But in the meantime, we don't really have anything. So we're using private internet and Starlink and other things of that just to try and come up with solutions for the minute, but it's not like a proper solution that we can roll out other places.
Just for the information of the committee and the witnesses here, it is on our work programme before the end of the year to bring NBI back before the committee for an update. So we leave that in the capable hands of the clerk in relation to a date for that, but the intention is to do that. Just can I ask one question of you, Dr. McCabe? And that is in terms of the uptake of technology. So, and I note what Deputy O'Queeve said earlier on, but there is still a hesitancy in using technology initially. When people see the benefit, absolutely they will use it, but it's to get over that threshold in the first place. And I'm just wondering, in terms of the engagement that you've had already with the community on Clare Island, what do you see as the biggest challenges in terms of that, or what are coming across as the biggest barriers in terms of the adoption of digital health for the community that you're engaging with? Because I think the learnings, we all believe that the learnings from Clare Island are learnings that can be applied right across this country. And the one concern that I have is that there will be a time lag between the delivery of the infrastructure, the development of the technology, and the actual practical application of that in communities. And we need to truncate that particular aspect. And the Clare Island project is vitally important in truncating that gap between the technology being delivered in software and hardware and its actual practical implementation and application in communities across the country.
So there's any number of different barriers. Where there is a motivation, where there's a need, these barriers are easy to overcome. So we have patients in their 80s who are whizzes on the apps and are taking their blood pressure and other measurements that it's no bother to them because they have they can see the benefit. It's avoiding a potentially hazardous trip for them that they would otherwise have to do. We're taking a whole community approach where we're trying to not just treat chronic conditions, but also to try and engage people in health promotion activities. And we're trying to do that through a number of apps. And there's a little bit of perhaps fatigue when you're introducing another app and another app, and there's not a direct benefit to it. But what I think is more useful is the fact that the younger and the older people are all kind of engaged in this together. And so when we've engaged the entire community, we've conducted, we've done blood pressure, we've done blood lipids, we've done everything, and everybody is there as a group talking about it together. So it's not a private thing necessarily that's happening hidden in between you and your doctor in an envelope you get, and you look at it in your room and say, oh no. It's something that you're talking about with your neighbours and friends. And that part, I think, has been successful in terms of the technology adoption. We're really working to streamline the technology, the software packages, the apps. But again, it's a learning curve, and we hope to iterate as well. So we hope to take the Clare Island project, and we very soon, we're in the contracting phase right now, we'll be doing it on something similar in Innisturk and Innisboffin as well. And for that one, we will have a cleaner, smoother rollout, and we would hope potentially that from there we can roll out to other islands, but learning at each stage. So there's not any one specific thing, but need drives adoption, that's for sure.
Can I thank the witnesses for their evidence here this morning, for the members' contributions. Look, I think the one thing that has consistently come up in terms of our engagement with the island communities, and something the committee is very committed to, is the issue of peer infrastructure. And I think, it's not just access that we've traditionally maybe perceived, but the challenges in terms of people, that have mobility issues as well. I think it was very interesting, the comment that was made earlier regarding infrastructure for the distribution of medicine. I think this is something that maybe the committee can take up with the HSE, and the broader issue then of a dedicated team of allied health professionals for our island communities, maybe to deal in a hybrid way, both physically and remotely, with the needs of the island communities. Can I make two further suggestions maybe, and that is that the committee would take the Limerick Declaration on rural healthcare and bring it to the attention of the Minister and look to see if this could be implemented. And I think we need to look at the broader issue of health services in rural areas, and we might engage with some of the witnesses here further in relation to that. No. The Limerick Declaration that Dr. Curtis spoke about in terms of having that adopted. So that was the one that she spoke about earlier on in her presentation. But just finally then, and I think you're right, Dr. Curtis, we're talking about an issue here in Ireland, but it's an issue globally in terms of access. Now, we're actually lucky that one of our colleagues is on a global committee looking at the issue of healthcare, and that's Senator Lorraine Clifford Lee, who is on the Interparliamentary Union Working Group on Health. So we will actually take your submission and present it to her. I know she is travelling soon to meet that working group, and we'll ask her to put it on the agenda for discussion so that the initiative coming from Limerick can actually get a global platform, not just addressing the issue here in Ireland for communities, both on the islands and rural communities elsewhere, but also other rural communities across the globe. So that concludes the committee's business in public session for today. I think we heard quite clearly that research has been conducted on different projects on all of our islands, and we heard examples of that today, and some of it happening wider afield as well. I think what has been important is it's not just very academic research. We're also looking at the practical application of research and the deployment of that to deal with real-world challenges in our communities, particularly our island communities. I'd like to thank the members for participating in today's meeting, and for all of the witnesses who contributed today for making this historic meeting possible. I'd like to particularly thank the islanders here on Mhór Island for their hospitality, and in particular the school community here for opening their doors, for hosting us in this fabulous new art room and interactive facility here in Garmskull, Vicdermid. Really is a fabulous setting here, and I think we've been surrounded by fabulous pieces of artwork. Normally in Leinster House, we're down in the basement. We don't even see daylight. Here, not only have we fabulous views out the window, a lovely bright room like this, but we're surrounded by such fabulous artwork as well. And I want to thank everyone that has been involved, the people behind the scenes that have been here over the last number of months, the staff within the Oireachtas for their assistance in actually making this very historic broadcast possible today. Garamila Mahagiv Galer for your assistance in relation to that. Thank you. So this meeting is now adjourned until Wednesday, the 27th of September at 9:30 a.m. when we'll meet in Committee Room 3 in Leinster House to consider the pre-legislative scrutiny of the Social Welfare Amendment Bill 2323. Garamag of Galer. Thank you.